Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we step into a wooden wagon rocking gently beneath a winter sky, somewhere along the vast Oregon Trail in the year 1848. Snow sweeps across the prairie in pale curtains. The wind rattles canvas overhead. The world beyond your little shelter has become a blur of white and grey. You are surrounded by hundreds of miles of open land. And if that sounds adventurous, well, you probably will not survive this, at least not comfortably. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know your location and local time. I always enjoy seeing where in the world these bedtime journeys find you. Now, dim the lights. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders and listen to the storm. The wagon creaks softly beneath each gust. The wooden frame complains in long, tired groans. Somewhere outside, snow hisses across frozen grass. The sound is strangely gentle, like waves sliding across a distant shore. Inside the wagon, however, things feel surprisingly warm. Not warm by modern standards, of course. Nobody's adjusting a thermostat to a cozy 72 degrees. Nobody is plugging in an electric blanket. The warmth comes from layers of wool, buffalo robes, shared body heat, and the simple fact that the storm is staying outside rather than inside. That counts as luxury in 1848. You shift slightly on the narrow bed of blankets laid across supplies and crates. A sack of flour presses awkwardly against your hip. A box of tools supports one corner of your pillow. Comfort is relative. A well-known historical reality is that most Oregon Trail emigrants travelled in wagons that were far less spacious than modern movies often suggest. Many people walked beside their wagons for hundreds of miles because animals needed every advantage possible. Riding all day could exhaust both wagon and livestock. Tonight, though nobody feels much like walking, the prairie has vanished beneath snow. Hours ago, the wagon company searched for a suitable campsite. They found a slight depression in the landscape that offered minimal protection from the wind. Minimal protection sounds disappointing until you experience a prairie blizzard firsthand. Then it sounds magnificent. The storm began shortly after sunset. At first, only scattered flakes drifted through the cold air. The horizon disappeared gradually. Then the wind arrived. Now it rushes endlessly across the grasslands. You imagine the enormous emptiness surrounding the wagon. Thousands upon thousands of acres stretch outward beneath darkness. No cities, no highways, no glowing gas stations promising hot coffee and clean restrooms. Just prairie and snow and people stubborn enough to cross a continent. The smell inside the wagon is familiar. Wool, leather, wood, a trace of smoke lingering in clothing, a hint of animal scent carried in from the oxen. None of it would impress a modern hotel reviewer. Yet after weeks on the trail, these smells have become comforting. They mean safety. They mean belonging. They mean you are still moving west. Across from you, another traveller shifts beneath blankets. Nobody says much. Words seem unnecessary. The day has been long. The cold has drained energy from everyone. Even conversation feels like work. Instead, people settle into silence. You listen to breathing. The steady rhythm creates a feeling of security. Outside, the wind may be fierce. Inside, life continues. You think about the journey behind you. Weeks of muddy crossings, long stretches of grassland, countless campsites, the endless routine of loading, unloading, cooking, cleaning, repairing, and moving again. Travel on the Oregon Trail demanded patience more than speed. Many emigrants discovered that the greatest challenge was not dramatic danger, but relentless repetition. Every morning began with chores. Every evening ended with chores, and somehow tomorrow always contained more chores. An unusual detail from trail life is that some emigrants carried surprisingly impractical possessions. Historical accounts mention heavy furniture, fancy china, large mirrors, and even musical instruments. Many of these treasured items were abandoned later when wagon weight became a serious problem. At the beginning of the journey, optimism weighs more than practicality. By the middle, practicality usually wins. The wagon rocks gently, snow accumulates against the wheels, canvas snaps sharply overhead. You wonder how much snow will fall before morning. Nobody can know. Weather forecasting remains far in the future. Instead, travellers rely on observation, cloud patterns, wind direction, animal behaviour, experience. Sometimes those clues help. Sometimes the prairie keeps its secrets. Researchers continue discussing exactly how emigrants interpreted weather signs across different regions of the trail, because diaries often describe conflicting methods and beliefs passed between wagon companies. For now, however, prediction matters less than endurance. The storm is here. The only task is waiting. You close your eyes for a moment. The darkness behind your eyelids feels deeper than usual. Fatigue settles over you. The kind earned honestly, not from office meetings, not from overflowing email inboxes, but from handling animals, hauling supplies, and confronting open wilderness. Your hands ache, your shoulders ache. Even your feet seem tired in places you never knew feet could become tired. And yet there is satisfaction hidden inside the discomfort. You are participating in one of the great migrations of American history. Thousands of people crossed these plains seeking opportunity, farmland, adventure, or simply a different future. Some arrived. Some turned back. Some never reached their destination. The trail asked much from everyone. The storm outside offers another reminder. Nature does not care about schedules. It does not care about ambitions. It certainly does not care about wagon timetables. The wind whistles through tiny gaps in the wagon. Cold air brushes your cheek. You pull a blanket higher. Immediately the warmth returns. Small victories matter here. Very small victories. A dry pair of socks, a sheltered campsite, an animal that stays healthy, a wheel that survives another day, a warm blanket during a blizzard. These become the building blocks of happiness. Outside, one of the oxen lets out a low sound. The noise drifts through darkness. Then silence returns. You picture the animals standing together against the storm. Patient creatures, essential creatures. Without them, the journey would stop immediately. Tomorrow will bring you. Yes. But tomorrow remains hidden beyond the snow. For now, you lie safely beneath canvas. The storm continues its endless dance across the prairie. The wagon creaks, the blankets hold warmth. And somewhere beyond the swirling darkness, the western horizon waits patiently for travellers brave enough to keep moving toward it. Tonight, though, movement can wait. Tonight there is only snow, shelter, and the slow approach of sleep. Canvas walls breathe around you. They do not breathe like lungs, of course, although after enough nights on the trail, almost anything begins to feel alive. The wagon canvas swells inward when the wind presses hard, then relaxes again when the gust slips past. It makes a low flapping sound, soft at first, then sudden, then soft again, as if the storm keeps placing a cold hand against the shelter just to remind you it is still there. You lie still and watch the pale curve of the canvas above you. In daylight, it looks ordinary enough. Thick cloth stretched over the hoops, useful, plain, a little stained from smoke, rain, dust, and weeks of handling. But tonight it feels like the thin line between life and something much less friendly. A practical truth about Oregon Trail wagons is that many were covered with heavy cotton canvas treated with oil, paint, or other mixtures to help shed rain. It was not magical waterproof armour. It was simply the best available barrier between travellers and weather, which is a polite way of saying everyone hoped it worked. Tonight, you're hoping very sincerely. The snow taps against the canvas in shifting rhythms. Sometimes it sounds like dry grains of sand thrown by the wind. Sometimes it lands in soft clumps that slide down the outside and drop somewhere near the wagon bed. The little noises gather into a kind of music. Not pretty exactly, but steady enough to become soothing. Inside, the air is close, warm breath clouds faintly, then disappears. You smell damp wool from coats hung nearby. You smell the leather straps tucked beside a crate. You smell a faint sourness from boots that have worked too hard across too much mud and frozen grass. Nobody apologizes for the boots. This is not a polite parlour evening in St. Louis. This is a prairie wagon in a blizzard, and the boots have earned their place. You reach out carefully and touch the wooden sideboard beside you. The wood feels cold even through your fingers. Beneath the wagon, the wheels are buried deeper now, locked in snow and hardened ruts. The whole structure seems both fragile and stubborn, which is also a fair description of everyone inside it. Another gust hits. The canvas snaps. Someone nearby stirs and whispers a few sleepy words. The voice is too low to understand, but the tone carries irritation. Even half asleep. The body knows when weather is being rude. You almost smile. A small bit of trail humour survives in the dark. Some emigrants joked in letters and diaries about the wagon as if it were both home and tormentor, a rolling room that protected them 1 hour and bruised them the next. That strange combination feels completely believable now. Your bed is shelter, your shelter is storage, your storage is bumping into your ribs. The wagon's interior is crowded with necessities: a small chest, a folded skillet, bags of meal, spare clothing, a tin cup, a coil of rope, a Bible or family book tucked carefully away, a few personal objects that no one could bear to leave behind. Each item takes space, each item has weight, each item may become useful at a moment nobody can predict. That is the strange math of migration. Bring too little, and you suffer. Bring too much, and the animals suffer. Bring the wrong things, and the trail teaches you slowly. Then all at once, outside, the blizzard keeps working. It fills hollows. It softens sharp edges. It turns wagon tracks into vague shadows beneath white. From inside your canvas shell, the prairie feels distant, almost imaginary, but you know it is there. Wide and open, stretching in every direction beyond this small pocket of warmth. You shift again, carefully this time. The boards beneath the bedding do not forgive sudden movement. You have learned this too. On the trail, comfort is often created through caution. Move slowly, save warmth, keep dry, guard small supplies, notice little changes. The difference between misery and tolerable misery can be one careful decision made before bedtime. There is a scholarly argument still circling around trail history about how prepared most emigrant families truly were for extreme weather. Some accounts suggest careful planning and community experience, while others reveal frightening gaps in knowledge, especially among travellers who had never faced the plains in harsh conditions. You think about that as the wind presses again. Were you prepared? The honest answer is probably yes and no. You brought blankets, you brought food, you brought tools, you brought hope, which weighs nothing and still somehow takes up space, but no list can fully prepare a person for lying awake inside a wagon while the night outside disappears beneath blowing snow. The canvas trembles overhead. A faint powder of frost has gathered along one seam. It glitters whenever the lantern's last ember glow catches it from a covered corner. You stare at it for a while, because staring at tiny frost crystals is exactly the sort of thing a tired person does when sleep is close but not quite ready to arrive. Quite a curious bit of frontier advice sometimes passed among travellers was to keep certain supplies wrapped in extra cloth or bedding, not only to protect them from weather, but also because everything in a wagon became part of the insulation strategy. Flour sacks, spare clothing, buffalo robes, and human bodies all helped shape warmer pockets of air. Basically, your storage system is also your heating system. Very elegant, very exhausting. You tuck your feet deeper beneath the blanket. Your toes are still cold. They may remain cold until Oregon, assuming Oregon is kind enough to receive them. Somewhere outside, a chain rattles against wood, then it stops. The sound leaves behind a silence so complete that the next breath inside the wagon seems loud. You become aware of how many layers separate you from the storm. Blanket, coat, dress or shirt, wool stockings, wagon side, canvas, darkness, snow, wind. Each layer matters. Each one is thin by itself. Together they form survival. That is one of the lessons the trail teaches over and over. Strength is rarely one grand thing. It is usually many small things arranged carefully. A knot tied well, a fire banked properly, a canvas flap secured before the storm rises, a blanket kept dry, a child placed between warmer bodies, a tired traveller remembering to cover the flour. You hear another person turn over. The wagon shifts slightly under the movement. The storm answers with a long, low moan across the prairie. It sounds almost human. You know it is only wind moving over land, through grass, around wagons, past animals, and into every gap it can find. Still, the imagination grows busy at night. The prairie becomes a voice. The wagon becomes a ship. The canvas becomes a sail, though thankfully no one has asked you to steer it, for a moment. You picture the wagon from outside, a small covered shape half hidden by snow. A dim glow softened through canvas. Oxen nearby in the dark. Other wagons arranged close, their outlines barely visible. People sleeping within each one, wrapped in their own private worries. From above, the camp would seem tiny. From inside, it is the whole world, or your eyelids grow heavier. The wind continues, but it no longer feels quite so sharp, becomes part of the night's rhythm. The canvas still strains, the wooden bows still creak, snow still slides and taps and gathers. Yet the shelter holds. For now, that is enough. You let the wagon breathe around you. You let the storm spend itself outside and inside these canvas walls, where every smell, creak, and borrowed warmth has become familiar. You sink a little deeper into the fragile comfort of being protected by almost nothing, and by everything that matters. The wagon settles into a deeper stillness, but the prairie does not. Outside, the night continues speaking in its own language. You lie quietly beneath the blankets and listen. At first, all you notice is the wind. It sweeps over the land in long waves, rising and falling without pattern. Sometimes it whistles sharply through unseen gaps. Sometimes it rumbles low across the grasslands like distant surf. Sometimes it seems to disappear entirely, only to return moments later with renewed determination. Yet as your ears adjust, other sounds begin to emerge. The prairie is never truly silent. It simply asks for patience. A soft clinking reaches you first. Metal touching metal. Perhaps a chain shifting against a wagon tongue. Perhaps a loose harness ring moving with the wind. The sound is small, but in the darkness it feels important. Then comes another noise, a faint snort, one of the oxen. The animal exhales heavily, sending steam into the frozen air. You cannot see it, but you can imagine it easily. Huge shoulders dusted with snow, thick hide facing the storm, patient eyes half closed against blowing flakes. The oxen may not be glamorous, but they are among the true heroes of the Oregon Trail. One commonly accepted historical observation is that oxen often prove more reliable than horses for long-distance emigrant travel. They moved more slowly, certainly, but they tolerated rough conditions better and required less specialized care. Slow and dependable, not a bad description of survival itself. Another snort comes from somewhere beyond the wagon. Then silence again. The camp feels suspended between sleep and vigilance. Nobody is fully awake. Nobody is fully unaware. That is the nature of trail life. Even at rest, part of your mind remains alert. You have spent too many weeks outdoors to forget the habit. A strange sound might mean an animal has broken loose. A shifting wheel might signal trouble. A sudden change in weather could demand immediate action. So while your body seeks sleep, your ears continue working. They gather information from the darkness. The wagon creaks softly. A wooden spoke settles under changing temperatures. The canvas flutters, snow brushes against the sides. Nearby, another wagon produces a muffled thump, someone turning over, perhaps a crate shifting inside. Tiny sounds travel surprisingly far during winter nights. The snow absorbs some noises while carrying others. The effect is oddly dreamlike. You feel as though the entire camp is floating inside a cloud. A low howl drifts across the prairie. You freeze for a moment, not from fear exactly, and more from curiosity. The sound comes again, long, thin, distant, a coyote, perhaps several. Their voices rise and fall somewhere beyond the camp, and you imagine them moving through the darkness, navigating the same storm that surrounds you. Coyotes were familiar companions on western trails. Travelers frequently reported hearing them at night, sometimes close enough to see glowing eyes near campfires. Thankfully, coyotes were usually more interested in scraps than people. A comforting thought, relatively. You pull the blanket slightly higher. The sound fades. Soon the prairie reclaims its stillness. You begin noticing other details, the rhythm of breathing inside the wagon, the occasional rustle of fabric, the gentle scraping of wool against wood, the small noises of human beings sharing limited space. Months from now, when the journey is over, you may remember these sounds more vividly than landscapes. The trail is built from ordinary moments, long hours, simple routines, quiet companionship. The dramatic streets survive in newspapers and memoirs, but daily life occupies far more time. Outside, another gust arrives. The wagon responds with a familiar groan. You almost know its voice now. Every wagon develops a personality. At least that is what tired travellers tell themselves. One squeaks constantly, another rattles, another leans slightly to one side. Your wagon seems to prefer complaining in long wooden sighs. You have heard worse. A curious frontier belief occasionally circulated among emigrants that unusual noises at night could be warnings or omens. Depending on who was telling the story, a creaking wheel, an owl call, or a distant animal cry might predict weather, luck, or misfortune. Most likely, the noises simply meant the prairie contained wheels, owls, and animals still after enough cold nights. Imagination becomes very persuasive. The darkness encourages storytelling. Your thoughts wander. You picture the camp from above again, wagons arranged in a rough circle, animals nearby, faint traces of firelight buried beneath drifting snow, families tucked inside canvas shelters, children asleep, adults pretending not to worry, everyone waiting for morning. The scale of the prairie remains difficult to comprehend, even now, especially now, in daylight. Distance stretches visibly across the horizon. At night, distance becomes mystery. The darkness beyond camp might contain 1 mile or 100. The effect is humbling. Many emigrants wrote about the emotional impact of the plains. Some described freedom. Others described loneliness. Many experienced both at the same time. You understand why. The prairie makes a person feel very small, not insignificant, just small. Part of something larger. The wind changes direction. You notice immediately. The sound against the canvas shifts. Snow strikes from a different angle. Even half asleep, trail travellers become amateur meteorologists. Your survival depends on paying attention. Historians continue debating how much environmental knowledge emigrants acquired during their journeys versus how much they borrowed from guides, traders, indigenous peoples, and experienced travellers already familiar with Western landscapes. Whatever the answer, learning happened quickly. The prairie was an effective teacher. Mistakes received immediate feedback. The coyote calls have vanished now. In their place comes another sound, a horse, not close, somewhere across camp. The animal stamps a hoof against frozen ground, then another, then quiet. Perhaps it is restless, perhaps cold, perhaps simply reminding everyone that horses, unlike wagon wheels, occasionally have opinions. The thought amuses you. You smile faintly into the darkness. Sleep feels closer now. The sounds no longer demand interpretation. They become part of a larger rhythm. Wind, canvas, oxen, breathing, wood, snow. The entire camp seems synchronized. Even the storm participates. You remember evenings back east, rooms with solid walls, windows, doors, proper beds. Yet there is something remarkable about this moment. You are farther from those comforts than you have ever been. And somehow, wrapped beneath blankets inside a wagon surrounded by snow and darkness, you feel unexpectedly secure. Perhaps because everyone around you shares the same challenge. Perhaps because hardship creates its own kind of community. Or perhaps because human beings adapt more quickly than they realize. The prairie continues whispering beyond the canvas. A wheel creaks once. A chain rattles softly. An ox exhales. Snow brushes against wood. None of the sounds seem threatening now. They are simply the sounds of life continuing. You listen as long as you can. Gradually the noises blur together. The distinctions fade. The storm becomes one great breathing presence around the camp. Your thoughts slow. Your muscles loosen. The darkness feels softer. And while the prairie keeps speaking beyond the wagon walls, you drift deeper into the warmth of blankets and familiar sounds, carried gently towards sleep by the voices of a winter night on the Oregon Trail. The smell of supper still lingers inside the wagon. It clings to the wool blankets, the wooden boards, the cuffs of sleeves, and the quiet air between sleeping bodies, cornmeal, smoke, boiled beans, a little salt pork if fortune has been unusually generous, and that faint metallic scent of tin cups cooling in the dark. It is not a feast. Nobody is arranging parsley on a plate. Nobody is asking whether the beans are locally sourced. They are sourced from a sack, and honestly, that is enough. Earlier, before the storm tightened fully around camp, you sat near the small fire with your bowl held close between both hands. The warmth rose into your fingers, steam touched your face. The food was plain. But after a day of cold travel, plain food can feel almost ceremonial. Each spoonful moved slowly, warming throat and stomach, settling the body after hours of motion. Period accounts consistently mention that trail meals were built around durable staples: flour, cornmeal, beans, bacon, coffee, dried fruit, rice, and whatever could be hunted, traded, or gathered along the way. Fresh food was treasured because it did not last long, and the prairie did not provide a convenient pantry with cheerful little labels. You remember the supper clearly because eating in a storm is never simple. The wind kept pushing smoke sideways. Sparks flew low across the snow. Someone crouched beside the fire, trying to shield the small flames with a pan lid, and a body turned like a wall. Another traveller stirred the pot with careful patience, as if beans could be persuaded into tenderness through moral encouragement. They could not, but everyone appreciated the effort. The fire had struggled from the beginning. Damp fuel hissed. Twigs cracked. Snow melted near the stones and made dark circles in the frozen earth. Each gust threatened to flatten the flame, and each time someone leaned in, fed it, nursed it, protected it. The fire was not just for cooking. It was morale. It was conversation. It was proof that human beings can argue with weather and occasionally win for a few minutes. You held your cup of coffee close, even though the coffee tasted bitter enough to make modern taste buds file a formal complaint. On the trail, coffee was beloved not because it was refined, but because it was hot, familiar, and sturdy. It gave adults something to hold while they pretended not to be worried. An overlooked detail from wagon travel is that coffee grounds were sometimes reused until they had surrendered every possible trace of flavour and dignity. Waste was foolish. Fresh supplies were limited. If the drink still looked vaguely brown, someone was probably willing to call it coffee. You took a sip anyway. It burned your tongue. You were grateful. Around the fire, faces glowed and vanished as flames flickered. Snow settled on hats and shoulders. People ate quickly because food cooled almost immediately in the wind. A child complained that the beans were hard. An adult said they were fine. The child looked unconvinced, which may have been the most historically accurate response available. Your own bowl warmed your hands better than it pleased your mouth. Still, hunger has a way of improving reviews. By the time the pot was empty, everyone seemed calmer. Not cheerful exactly. Cheerful is a strong word for being trapped in a prairie blizzard with frozen boots and a spoon that tastes faintly of smoke. But steadier, more settled. Food does that. It gives the day a shape. Morning begins with something. Evening ends with something. Between those two small meals, survival does its long, dusty work. As the wind rose harder, the group moved quickly. Tin cups were wiped, not washed properly, because water meant labour. The pot was scraped clean. Leftovers, if any existed, were saved with a seriousness usually reserved for treasure. Flour sacks were checked. Bacon was wrapped again. Coffee was secured. Everything had to be put away. A storm could scatter loose items in moments. The Prairie had no respect for careless housekeeping. You remember crawling back into the wagon, with fingers stiff from cold. The canvas flap snapped behind you. Someone pulled it closed and tied it down. For a moment, the darkness inside felt complete. Then a small lantern glowed, low and golden, turning the crowded wagon into a narrow chamber of shadows. The supper things came in with you. A skillet, 2 cups, a wooden spoon, a cloth bundle of food. The smell followed, wrapping itself into the night. Now, as you lie under blankets, that smell remains like a gentle reminder of the evening's work. You can almost taste the cornmeal again, thick, grainy, simple. There is comfort in its plainness. Researchers continue to examine how emigrant diets affected health and morale across the long trail, especially during harsh weather, when variety disappeared and cooking conditions became miserable. Some evidence suggests that hunger was not always constant, but monotony was. A person could have enough calories and still dream sadly of fresh apples, soft bread, or a meal that did not come from the same tired pot. You understand that deeply now. Your thoughts drift toward kitchens left behind. A real table, a chair that does not wobble on frozen ground, bread baked in an oven, milk that has not travelled beside spare horseshoes. The memory feels distant, almost luxurious. But it does not make you unhappy, not exactly. It simply reminds you that comfort is partly a matter of contrast. Tonight, the wagon's narrow darkness feels warm because the world outside is so cold. The blankets feel soft because the boards beneath them are so hard. The smell of beans feels homely because the prairie beyond the canvas has no walls, no hearth, no familiar cupboards. A small sound comes from the corner, someone shifting in sleep. A cup rolls slightly, then stops against a folded coat. The storm continues pressing snow against the wagon. You wonder whether the fire outside has fully died now. Most likely it has been banked under ash or smothered by weather. In gentler conditions, coals might be preserved for morning. Tonight, the storm may decide otherwise. That means tomorrow someone will coax flame from whatever dry material remains. Another chore, always another chore. The thought should feel discouraging. But it arrives softly. You're too tired to resent tomorrow properly. Your stomach is warm, that matters. Food changes the body's relationship with cold. After supper, the chill still touches you, but it no longer seems to reach as deeply. You feel heavier, slower, more willing to surrender to the night. The wagon creaks. The blankets rustle. A faint settle of smoke rises from your sleeve when you bring your hand near your face. You have carried the fire indoors in the fabric of your clothes. Not the flame, of course, it's just its memory. That is enough for now. The meal has ended, but its quiet work continues. It steadies the body, softens fear, and gives the mind something ordinary to hold. On a trail filled with uncertainty, ordinary things become precious. A spoon, a cup, a shared pot, a few tired jokes muttered through steam and snow. You listen as the storm moves around the wagon. Outside, the prairie is white and wild. Inside, supper has left its warmth behind. And while the last traces of smoke, beans, coffee, and cornmeal settle into the blankets, you breathe slowly, letting the humble meal become part of the shelter, part of the night, and part of the strange comfort of sleeping warm inside a wagon while winter searches patiently for a way in. The warmth from supper fades slowly, not all at once, not dramatically. It slips away in stages, like the last glow from a campfire after the flames have disappeared. Your stomach remains comfortably full, but the cold begins reclaiming territory. First your fingertips, then your nose, then that stubborn patch near your feet that seems determined to remain chilly no matter how many blankets are piled over it. You curl slightly beneath the bedding. The wagon is quiet now, very quiet. The sort of quiet that only arrives when exhaustion finally defeats conversation. Everyone around you has reached that point. The long journey, the storm, the cold, and the simple work of surviving another day have drained away the desire to speak. Only breathing remains, the soft rise and fall of sleeping bodies, the occasional rustle of fabric, the low creak of wood settling under changing temperatures. You pull another corner of blanket closer around your shoulders. Every inch matters. A small opening near the neck can invite surprising amounts of cold air. Trail travelers learned this lesson repeatedly, often while lying awake wondering why one's shoulder felt as though it had been personally selected by winter for special attention. Surviving journals frequently mention the importance of bedding on western journeys. Good blankets, buffalo robes, wool coverings, and spare clothing were not luxuries. They were protective equipment in the most literal sense. So, tonight, you appreciate every thread. The wagon remains warmer than the world outside, but warm is a relative term. If a modern traveller suddenly appeared here with a digital thermometer, they might have serious concerns. You choose not to imagine that. Instead, you focus on the pocket of warmth you have managed to create. Blankets beneath you, blankets above you, a coat folded near your side, a nearby body contributing a little shared heat to the cramped interior. Together, these small defences create something remarkable. Comfort, not perfect comfort, frontier comfort. The distinction matters. A gust strikes the wagon. Canvas snaps sharply overhead. The sound pulls you briefly from the edge of sleep. You wait. The wagon holds. The canvas bows inward slightly, then relaxes. The storm continues. You remain dry. A successful night on the trail often begins with that simple achievement. Dry, not glamorous, not exciting, just dry. One frequently overlooked aspect of emigrant life was how much energy people devoted to staying dry. Wet clothing could quickly become dangerous in cold conditions. A soaked blanket was not merely unpleasant, it could become a serious threat when temperatures dropped. The lesson seems obvious now. On the trail, it was essential knowledge. Your hand brushes against the rough wool covering your chest. The texture feels familiar after weeks of travel. Wool scratches. Wool smells faintly of sheep. Wool can become heavy when damp, yet wool also keeps people alive. That tends to improve its reputation. Outside, snow continues gathering it against the wagon wheels. You cannot see it happening, but you can imagine the growing drifts. Each flake joins countless others, quietly reshaping the landscape. By morning, familiar landmarks may look completely different. A fence post becomes a mound, a rut becomes invisible, A path becomes a memory. The prairie excels at reinvention. You shift again, seeking the perfect sleeping position. Unfortunately, the Oregon Trail did not provide mattresses designed by luxury bedding companies. A crate presses gently into your side. Something hard lurks beneath the blankets near your knee. You investigate carefully. A cooking utensil. Wonderful. Exactly what every tired traveller hopes to discover while trying to sleep. You move it elsewhere. The improvement is immediate. Tiny victories. The trail is full of them. A curious detail appears in several emigrant accounts. Some travellers describe becoming so accustomed to sleeping in cramped conditions that ordinary beds felt strange when they finally reached settled communities again. The human body adapts surprisingly fast, especially when given little choice in the matter. You suspect there is truth in that observation. Several months ago, you might have complained bitterly about these sleeping arrangements. Tonight, they seem almost reasonable, not good, reasonable. Progress comes in many forms. The wagon rocks slightly under another gust. Your eyes remain closed. You listen. Wind, canvas, breathing, wood. The sounds have become familiar companions. Each one confirms that the wagon is still standing, the camp is still together, and the night is still moving forward. There is comfort in repetition. Researchers continue examining how emigrants adapted psychologically to long periods of uncertainty and discomfort. Many personal accounts suggest that routines became surprisingly important. Familiar habits helped create stability, even when the surrounding world remained unpredictable. You understand that instinctively. The same blankets, the same cup, the same chores, the same veiled faces. These ordinary things become anchors. Without them, the vastness of the prairie might feel overwhelming. A faint chill reaches your cheek. You tuck your face deeper into the blanket. Better. Immediately better. The body becomes a careful manager of resources during winter nights. Every bit of warmth is tracked. Every draft is noticed. Every improvement is appreciated. Feels almost strategic. Picture the oxen outside. They stand through weather that would send modern people racing toward heated buildings and online weather alerts. The animals endure because they must. You endure because there is no practical alternative. Strangely, that realization feels calming. Many worries disappear when choices become simple. Stay warm, stay dry, rest, wake tomorrow, continue west. The storm may be fierce, but its demands are straightforward. The complexities of ordinary life have been stripped away. What remains is immediate and tangible. You need shelter. You have shelter. You need blankets. You have blankets. You need the wagon to survive the night. So far, it is doing an admirable job. Another sound drifts through the darkness. A distant cough from another wagon. Then silence. You imagine dozens of similar scenes unfolding throughout the camp. Families bundled together, children sleeping heavily, adults worrying quietly, everyone waiting for dawn. The shared experience creates an invisible bond. No formal agreement is required. Everyone understands the challenge because everyone is living it. The wind eases briefly. The sudden reduction in noise feels almost startling. For a few moments, the prairie becomes incredibly still. You hear only breathing, your own, others nearby, the slow rhythm of human beings resting after a difficult day. Then the wind returns, not as fiercely, just enough to remind you that winter remains outside. You smile faintly beneath the blanket. The storm has not won, at least not tonight. The wagon still stands. The canvas still holds. The blanket still trap precious warmth. Your body relaxes further. The cold remains present, but it no longer feels like an enemy pressing against the walls. It feels more like a distant visitor lingering outside the door, beyond the canvas. Snow continues drifting across the prairie. Beyond the prairie lies the long road west. But those concerns belong to tomorrow. Tonight belongs to blankets. Breath, and the quiet satisfaction of staying warm enough. You settle deeper into your small nest of wool and canvas. The sounds grow softer, the darkness grows gentler, and as the storm wanders endlessly across the sleeping plains, you drift closer to sleep, wrapped in the fragile but stubborn comfort that has carried travellers through winter nights for generations. A deep sound rolls through the darkness. Not wind, not canvas, not the shifting wood of the wagon. An ox. The low rumble vibrates faintly through the night, steady and reassuring. It comes from somewhere just beyond the shelter, followed by the scrape of a hoof against frozen ground. You open your eyes for a moment. The wagon remains dark except for the faintest suggestion of moonlight filtering through the canvas. Snow reflects what little light exists, creating a pale glow that softens the shadows. Outside, the animals are still awake, or at least awake enough to remind the world they exist. You listen carefully. Another hoof scrapes, a harness ring clinks, a heavy body shifts its weight. The sounds are slow and deliberate, unlike nervous horses. Oxen rarely waste energy on dramatic displays. They are practical creatures. They move when necessary. They rest when possible. They seem almost professionally committed to conserving effort. That attitude makes them excellent trail companions. Historical records indicate that many emigrant groups preferred oxen over horses or mules for long wagon journeys. Oxen could survive on rough forage, tolerate difficult conditions, and pull heavy loads for extended periods. They were slower, certainly, but reliability often mattered more than speed. The Oregon Trail rewarded patience. The animals understood this long before the humans did. You imagine them standing together now, snow resting along broad backs, breath rising in pale clouds. Massive shoulders turned against the wind. The storm that feels enormous to you is simply another unpleasant evening to them. Not enjoyable, not catastrophic, just weather. There is something admirable about that perspective. A stronger gust sweeps across the prairie. The wagon trembles slightly. Outside, one of the oxen answers with another deep snort. You almost picture the animal expressing mild annoyance. Not fear, not panic, just irritation. A very reasonable response to being covered in snow. You pull the blanket higher and think about how much depends on those animals. The entire migration depends on them. Without oxen, wagons do not move. Without wagons, supplies disappear. Without the supplies, journeys end quickly. The animals are transportation, labour force, and survival equipment combined into one large package with horns. That realisation tends to encourage respect. Many emigrants developed strong attachments to their teams. Diary entries occasionally mention favourite oxen by name, praising endurance, strength, or unusual personalities. When animals were lost, the emotional impact could be surprisingly profound. After all, these creatures shared every mile. They crossed rivers, climbed hills, pulled through mud, endured heat, endured dust, endured snow. They earned their place in family stories. Outside, another small series of sounds drifts through camp. A chain, a hoof, a muffled voice, perhaps someone checking the animals before attempting sleep again. No responsible traveller ignored livestock during difficult weather. The animals needed attention even when people desperately wanted rest. That was one of the less glamorous realities of frontier travel. The work never completely stopped. An unusual detail from trail journals is that some immigrants occasionally braided identifying marks into tails, or used distinctive ribbons, and tags to help distinguish animals when large wagon companies camped together. Hundreds of animals could be gathered near a campsite, and ownership disputes were much easier to avoid when everyone knew which ox belonged to whom. You imagine trying to explain that situation to a modern traveller. Good news, we found your transportation. Excellent. It weighs over 1,000 pounds and answers primarily to grass. Different centuries create different challenges. The storm continues pressing snow across the prairie. Yet beneath the noise, the camp feels stable. The oxen help create that feeling. Their presence represents continuity. As long as they remain healthy and calm, tomorrow remains possible. You think about tomorrow, not in detail, just generally. The trail, the snow, the endless western horizon. There will be decisions to make once daylight arrives. Can the company travel? Must they wait? How deep is the accumulation? Has the route disappeared entirely? Questions for morning, questions for people with energy, At the moment, you're content to let future problems remain in the future. The wagon creaks softly, an ox exhales, the rhythm continues. Evidence from emigrant journals shows that livestock care consumed a significant portion of the daily labour. Feeding, watering, monitoring injuries, checking harnesses, and recovering wandering animals all demanded constant attention. Travellers often discovered that their schedules revolved around animal needs as much as their own. It is an arrangement based on mutual dependence. Humans need the animals need the humans. Neither side gets much choice in the matter. Outside, the wind eases slightly. The change reveals other sounds. The faint brushing of snow against grass, a distant movement from another section of camp, a horse shaking its mane. The prairie feels larger somehow when the wind quiets. Its vastness becomes more noticeable. The darkness stretches farther. The spaces between sounds become deeper. You picture the camp from the animal's perspective. No maps, no destination, no grand vision of Oregon, just familiar voices, food, water, shelter from the worst weather. Perhaps that simplicity has advantages. Humans carry entire futures in their heads. Oxen seem content carrying wagons. Researchers continue exploring how emigrants balanced affection for working animals with the practical realities of frontier life. Sources reveal both genuine emotional bonds and difficult decisions made under harsh conditions. The relationship was rarely simple. Very little on the trail was simple. Yet tonight offers a rare exception. The task is straightforward. Remain warm, rest, wait for dawn. Even the animals seem to understand. Their movements have grown less frequent. The camp settles deeper into sleep. Snow accumulates quietly around wagon wheels and hooves. The storm still wanders across the prairie, but its energy feels more distant now, less aggressive, more persistent. Like a guest who refuses to leave but has grown tired of making a scene. You shift slightly beneath the blankets. The warmth has improved, or perhaps your body has simply accepted its circumstances. Adaptation often feels like improvement. Your thoughts drift toward the trail behind you. Thousands of miles of movement, countless camps, endless horizons, and through all of it, the steady presence of the animals, every river crossed, every hill climbed, every difficult mile travelled. The oxen were there, pulling, waiting, enduring. Their contribution rarely receives dramatic attention in stories. Heroes usually arrive on horseback. Oxen lack that kind of publicity. Yet here on the prairie, surrounded by snow and darkness, their importance feels impossible to ignore. Another deep breath drifts through the night. An ox, still there, still standing, still ready for whatever tomorrow brings. The sound settles into your thoughts like an anchor. Solid, dependable, comforting. The camp remains secure. The wagon remains upright. The animals remain close. Outside, winter continues its endless work across the plains. Inside, beneath blankets and canvas, you allow yourself to relax fully at last. The soft noises of livestock merge with the wind and the creaking wagon. Together they become a lullaby unique to the Oregon Trail, a song of patience, a song of endurance, a song carried by broad shoulders and steady hooves across an immense sleeping prairie. By the time the storm begins to loosen its grip on the deepest part of night, the road has already disappeared. Not the idea of the road, not the memory of it, but the actual track beneath the wagon wheels. The ruts pressed into the prairie by thousands of hooves, wheels, and tired feet has vanished under snow. You cannot see this from inside the wagon. Of course, you are still wrapped in blankets, listening to canvas shiver and oxen breathe. Yet somehow you know it. The storm has been too steady, too patient, too thorough. It has worked for hours with soft white hands, filling every groove, smoothing every mark, erasing the long scar of travel from the land by morning. The trail will look less like a road and more like a question. You lie still and imagine yesterday's path. In daylight, the route had seemed obvious enough. Wagon ruts cut through frozen ground, old campfire marks darkened patches of earth. Bones, broken tools, discarded furniture, and scraps of cloth sometimes appeared along the way. Grim little signposts left by other travellers who'd already paid the trail's toll. Not exactly the scenic highway system, but useful. Now snow covers everything. The prairie becomes blank. A recurring theme in emigrant writings is that the Oregon Trail was not one neat road, but a shifting network of paths, cut-offs, river crossings, campsites, and seasonal choices. Wagons often followed visible ruts, but weather, terrain, water, grass, and local advice could all change the exact route. So when snow hides the ruts, it does more than make travel inconvenient. It hides certainty. The wagon creaks softly beneath you. Somewhere outside, a rope knocks against wood. You picture the men and older boys in the company waking before sunrise, stepping out into cold that bites immediately through clothing. They will stamp their boots, squint into whiteness, and try to read the land. They will search for rises, creek beds, trees, old tracks, anything that proves the world still has direction. You can almost hear the conversation already. Was the trail bending south yesterday? Did the creek lie beyond that low ridge? Was the last landmark a stand of cottonwoods or just willows? How far to the next water? All of this will matter. The map. If anyone has one worth trusting, may be useful, but maps of the period often simplify what the land makes complicated. A line across paper does not tell you where snowdrifts have gathered, where grass lies buried, or where an ox team may founder in hidden mud beneath white crust. A modern traveller might open a phone and wait for a blue dot to explain existence. Here, your blue dot is a tired man pointing into blowing snow and saying, "I think it's that way." Very comforting, very frontier. You shift under the blankets and feel the hard shape of a supply box beneath your bedding. It reminds you that the wagon itself is part home, part lifeboat, part stubborn wooden argument against distance. But a wagon without a road is an awkward thing. It can cross open country, yes, but it prefers guidance. Wheels like paths, animals like paths, people like paths most of all. Paths mean someone has gone before. Snow removes that comfort. Among the more unexpected aspects of trail travel was how much emigrants relied on traces left by earlier groups. A broken wagon part might warn of difficult terrain. A cluster of graves might signal illness or danger nearby. Even abandoned goods, sad as they were, could confirm that the company remained on a known route. Tonight, the storm hides those traces under silence. The thought makes the wagon feel smaller. You listen again to the night outside. Wind moves across the camp, softer now but still cold. Snow slides from the canvas in small sighs. The oxen shift patiently. Their bodies hold no opinion about Oregon, no grand anxiety about maps, yet they will be asked to pull tomorrow into being. Your own breathing slows. You try not to worry. Worry is not useful in the dark. Still, the mind wanders where it wants. What happens if the company chooses wrong? What if a creek is missed? What if the snow hides a ravine? What if the wagons scatter on the trail? Direction is survival, yet uncertainty is part of the journey. Woven into every mile, the historical record remains unclear on how often small wagon companies lost the main track during severe weather, compared with how often such stories were later exaggerated in memory. Some diaries describe frightening confusion, while others mention detours almost casually, as if getting misplaced on a continent were merely another Tuesday. Perhaps both are true. Fear and the routine often live together. You think of the ruts again. In dry weather, they could be deep enough to guide wheels almost automatically. In mud, they became traps. In snow, they vanished. The trail offered help and hardship in the same gesture. Depending on the day's mood, a faint greyness begins to gather beyond the canvas. Not dawn yet, only the earliest thinning of darkness. The wagon interior slowly takes shape around you. Bundles, blankets, the curve of the hoops overhead, a tin cup near someone's boot, a child's mitten tucked beside a sack. Everything is quiet. But the stillness has changed. Night still covers the camp, yet morning has begun preparing its entrance. Soon people will move. Someone will untie the canvas flap. Cold air will rush in rudely, because apparently winter has no manners. Boots will be pulled on. Fingers will fumble with buttons. Someone will mutter about the snow. Someone else will answer with a sound that is not quite a word but communicates deep agreement. You remain still for a few more breaths, savouring the last warmth before the day begins making demands. Outside, the hidden road waits, or perhaps it does not wait. Perhaps it has become the whole prairie, asking the travellers to choose carefully. You remember yesterday's landscape as best you can, the low roll of land, the pale grass, the creek line dark in the distance, the way the wagons curve slightly before camp. You try to hold these fragments together like pieces of a quilt. Memory becomes a map when marks disappear. So does conversation, so does trust. A leader may know more than others, or simply sound more confident. An experienced guide may read wind-packed snow, slope, and drainage with practiced eyes. A young traveller may spot a half-buried rut. A child may remember passing a strange bent tree. Everyone's attention matters when the land turns blank. This is one of the quieter truths of the trail. Survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is collective noticing. A sound comes from outside, footsteps. Slow, crunching, close to the wagon. Someone is already awake. The steps pause near the animals, then continue. A low voice speaks softly to an ox. The animal exhales in answer. The day is beginning whether you are ready or not. You open your eyes fully. The canvas above you glows faintly with reflected snowlight. The storm has softened, but its work remains. It has covered the road. Buried yesterday, and left the camp suspended in a white world without clear edges. You take a slow breath. The air smells of wool, wood, smoke, and cold. The hidden road will have to be found again. Not all at once, not by magic, by eyes, memory, patience, and the steady pull of animals who do not understand the size of the story they are helping carry. For now, you stay beneath the blankets a moment longer, listening to the camp wake around you. While beyond the canvas, the snow-covered prairie waits in silence. Smooth as an unwritten page, the wagon wakes in layers. First comes the smallest movement. A blanket shifts, a sleeve brushes against canvas, someone sighs with the deep disappointment of a person remembering that morning has arrived and brought weather with it. Then comes the whispering. Soft voices, careful and low, moving through the dim interior before anyone fully sits up. The wagon is too crowded for sudden gestures. One careless elbow can meet a rib. One boot can disturb a sleeping child. One misplaced hand can find the cold side of a tin cup, which is a rude way to begin any century. You open your eyes slowly. Grey snowlight fills the canvas cover. It is not bright, but it is enough to reveal the close world around you. Blankets overlap in every direction. A child sleeps curled beside an adult, hair tangled against a wool collar. Another traveller lies with knees bent because the supply chest leaves no room to stretch fully. Someone's shawl has slipped during the night and now rests half over a flour sack. as if the flower also deserves comfort. Honestly, after what it has been through, perhaps it does. The wagon smells of sleep, wool, smoke, leather, and cold breath. It is not unpleasant exactly, it is simply human, a small, crowded human atmosphere contained by wood and canvas while the prairie outside lies buried under snow. Surviving letters from emigrants describe how family privacy nearly disappeared on the trail. Wagons, tents, and open camps forced people into constant closeness, where sleeping, eating, worrying, arguing, nursing, mending, and planning all happened within reach of other bodies and other ears. You understand that now. There is no private room here, no hallway, no door to close, no quiet corner where a person can dramatically stare out a window and contemplate destiny. There is only the wagon, and everyone is in it. Someone whispers, "Is it still snowing?" Another voice answers, "Not as hard." That is good news. Maybe on the trail. Good news often arrives wearing a suspicious coat. Not as hard can mean easier travel. It can also mean the blizzard has already done its damage and is now resting smugly on top of the road. A child opens one eye, then closes it again, making the wise decision to postpone existence. You envy this strategy. The adult beside the child gently tucks the blanket higher. The motion is automatic, practiced, tender without ceremony. Close quarters may remove privacy, but they also reveal care in its smallest forms. A blanket pulled up, a mitten found, a cup passed, a quiet warning not to step there because that board is icy. Families on the trail learned each other's rhythms with unusual precision. Who wakes early? Who moves slowly? Who needs food before conversation? Who becomes irritable when cold? Who pretends not to be afraid? In a wagon, nobody can hide very well. You push yourself up carefully, avoiding the hanging skillet and the corner of a crate. Your shoulder brushes the canvas. Cold moisture seeps through the fabric and touches your sleeve. Wonderful. The wagon has found a way to share the weather after all. A younger voice asks whether the road is gone. No one answers immediately. That silence says more than words. Finally, someone says, "We'll see." It is the most honest answer available. The question remains open among specialists as to how children experienced the emotional strain of westward migration. Some diary accounts written later in life remember adventure, open land, and excitement. Others recall fear, fatigue, hunger, and loss. Most likely, childhood on the trail contained all of these at once, sometimes before breakfast. The child seems to accept the answer. Children become experts at reading adults. They may not understand routes, weather systems, or migration politics, but they understand tone. They know when a whisper is meant to calm them. They know when grown people are pretending confidence into existence. Inside the wagon, everyone begins the careful choreography of rising. A knee moves. A blanket folds, a boot is located, then its partner is not located, which causes a quiet search filled with controlled frustration. The missing boot appears beneath a sack, naturally. The boot has not improved overnight. It is stiff with cold, damp near the sole, and shaped like a small punishment. The person putting it on winces but says nothing. Complaining is allowed on the trail, but only in measured doses. Too much complaining wastes breath, and breath is currently being used to warm hands. A lesser-known frontier habit involves sleeping in portions of clothing during severe weather, not for convenience, but because dressing from nothing in freezing air was a misery best avoided. Many travellers kept outer garments close, layered bedding over clothes, and accepted the wrinkles as part of survival. Fashion has left the wagon. Survival is wearing 3 layers and one expression of mild regret. The canvas flap near the front trembles. Someone outside speaks to the oxen. The sound reaches you muffled and low. It reminds everyone that the world beyond this crowded shelter has begun moving. Soon the flap will open, Cold air will pour in, the day will demand effort from every person, whether rested or not. For a few moments more, though, the family remains together in the dim warmth. You notice the small arrangement of objects around each person, a comb tucked near a bedroll, a folded letter wrapped carefully in the cloth, a child's carved toy, a worn book, a sewing kit. These tiny possessions make the wagon feel less like a cargo box and more like a home that has been asked to roll across a continent. Home, apparently, can be very mobile when properly overburdened. You hear a quiet sniffle. Not crying exactly, or so, just cold and tiredness gathering at the edge of emotion. An adult reaches across the narrow space and squeezes a hand. Nothing grand is said. Nothing grand needs to be said. The gesture settles the air. Modern interpretations vary when discussing whether emigrant families were held together more by shared hope, economic necessity, religious faith, or simple momentum once the journey began. The sources offer different answers, because families themselves were different. But inside this wagon, in this small morning after snow, the bond feels less like an idea and more like warmth passed from hand to hand. Someone laughs softly when the second boot proves nearly as unpleasant as the first. The laugh is quiet, but it changes the mood. Not dramatically, just enough. A small release, a reminder that fear does not get to occupy every corner. The child opens both eyes now and asks if there will be breakfast. That question receives a quicker answer. Yes, of some sort. Possibly not a breakfast anyone would request in a restaurant, but still, breakfast, cornmeal, coffee, maybe a little bacon if supplies allow, something hot if fire can be coaxed from the morning. The promise of food moves everyone forward. You wrap a shawl tighter and prepare yourself. The wagon no longer feels like a sleeping place. It becomes a staging ground. The close warmth of night gives way to the cramped efficiency of morning. Bedding must be folded, supplies checked, cups found, children put dressed, adults organised. Worries packed away alongside flour and rope because there is work to do. Outside, the hidden road waits beneath snow. Inside, the family gathers itself. You take one last breath of the warm, still, smoky air. Carries the whole night within it. Supper, sleep, fear, breath, blankets, and the patient closeness of people who have very little room but somehow make space for one another. Then the canvas flap opens, cold floods in, everyone inhales sharply, and the prairie morning enters the wagon, white, bright, and waiting. The cold enters like it owns the place. As the canvas flap opens, morning air spills through the wagon and slides under blankets, into sleeves, around ankles, across faces still soft with sleep. Everyone reacts at once in small, honest ways. A sharp inhale, a muttered complaint, a hand pulling wool tighter, a child vanishing halfway beneath a blanket as if human beings were meant to hibernate for one brief moment. The wagon feels less like shelter and more like a box full of people being seasoned by winter. Then the flap is tied back, and pale light pours in. Outside, the camp is white. Snow clings to wagon wheels, piles against boxes, rests on the backs of animals, and covers the remains of last night's fire. The prairie stretches beyond the wagons in soft, blank folds. The storm has weakened, but the air remains restless, carrying loose powder close to the ground. You climb down carefully. Your boot sinks into snow with a muted crunch. The shock of cold travels straight through the soul. Good morning, Prairie. Very rude of you. Near the centre of the camp, several travellers gather around the place where the fire had been. At first it looks dead, just a dark patch in the snow, half buried under ash and white crust. But someone kneels and begins scraping gently with a stick. A faint red glow appears beneath the grey. Everyone notices, no one cheers, but the mood shifts. Fire survived the night, that matters. Trail diaries repeatedly mention the importance of preserving coals from one evening to the next. Striking a new fire in wind, damp, or snow could be difficult and slow, so banked embers saved labour, time, and patience. 3 resources always in short supply. The person kneeling leans closer and shields the ember with both hands. Another traveller brings dry shavings from a pouch. Someone else holds a scrap of cloth, carefully protected from moisture. The work is delicate, almost tender. You watch as the little glow is fed. A curl of smoke rises, then another. The smoke smells sharp and familiar. A mixture of charred wood, damp ash, and hope trying not to embarrass itself. The ember catches a sliver of kindling. A small flame appears, thin, unsteady, beautiful. It bends in the wind, nearly disappears, then stands again. Around you, people move with renewed purpose. Fire means hot coffee, fire means warmed hands. Fire means breakfast that is more than cold leftovers and regret. Fire also means people can gather, talk, assess the storm, and pretend to be more confident than they feel. You step closer, holding your hands out. The heat is faint at first. The flames are too small and the air too cold. Still, your fingers respond immediately. They ache as blood returns. The feeling is uncomfortable, but welcome, like being scolded by your own circulation. A detail often overlooked today is how carefully emigrants guarded fire-making materials. Matches existed, but they were not the cheap, endless convenience modern people imagine. Travellers also used flint, steel, tinder, dry cloth, and preserved coals. In bad weather, dry tinder could feel as precious as coin. The small flame strengthens. Kindling crackles. Someone adds a thicker stick, then waits to be sure the fire can handle it. Too much too soon could smother it. Fire, like a tired traveller, has limits. You crouch near the growing warmth and look around camp. The wagons stand in a rough cluster, their canvas covers sagging slightly beneath snow. Oxen shift nearby, broad and patient, their breath rising in steam. A few people brush snow from harnesses, others inspect wheels. Children stand close to adults, quiet in the cold, faces pink above scarves and collars. No one moves quickly unless necessary. Winter punishes haste. The fire becomes the centre of everything. People approach one by one, hands extended, shoulders hunched, expressions still heavy with sleep. Someone sets a kettle near the flames, someone else breaks ice from the rim of a water bucket, and the sound is crisp and oddly satisfying. Coffee will come soon. Not good coffee, perhaps, but hot. That is enough to make it respectable. The debate remains alive among historians about whether campfires along the trail were mainly practical centres or social centres. The simple answer is that they were both. They cooked food, warmed bodies, dried clothing, discouraged some animals, and created the emotional feeling of a room in a world without walls. You feel that now, the firelight, even in morning, draws people inward. It creates a circle. Inside that circle, the prairie feels slightly less enormous. The road may be hidden, the snow may be deep, the day may be uncertain, but for the moment there is flame, and flame gives the mind somewhere to rest. A man from another wagon stamps snow from his boots and says the drifts are deeper to the north. Someone answers that the wind likely packed them high along the shallow rise. Another points toward the south and claims there may be lower ground there. No one sounds certain. The fire pops, a child flinches, then laughs softly. Oh. The sound is small, but it brightens the air. You remember last night's supper, the steam from the beans, the bitter coffee, the way smoke followed everyone into the wagon. That same smoky scent now returns, stronger and fresher, clinging to the cold morning like a promise. The flames grow, orange light flickers across faces. Snow near the stones begins to shrink and darken. Drops of meltwater hiss when they touch hot ash. A pot is set more securely. Breakfast is becoming possible. That word alone steadies everyone. Possible. So much of trail life lives inside that word. Travel is possible. Repair is possible, warmth is possible, finding the road is possible, not guaranteed. Of course, the Prairie does not hand out guarantees. It barely hands out decent seating, but possibility is enough to pull people forward. You rub your hands together and breathe into them. The air burns inside your nose. Your coat smells of smoke again. Soon all your clothing will. There is no escaping it. On the trail, smoke becomes part of identity. Hair, blankets, sleeves, shawls, even food seem to carry it. You stop noticing after a while. Then, years later perhaps, one faint smoky scent may return and bring the whole prairie back in an instant. The fire snaps again. A traveller adds a small armful of fuel. Not too much. Wood is never taken for granted on the open plains. In some stretches, buffalo chips, dried grasses, shrubs, or gathered fragments of driftwood served as fuel when trees were scarce. The prairie required creativity, and occasionally a strong tolerance for unusual smells. You watch the flames bend toward the wind. They survive. Everyone watches. Though no one admits it, the fire is small, but it has become the camp's beating heart. Around it, the morning organizes itself. Coffee darkens in the pot. Cornmeal is measured. Harness leather is checked near the warmth so stiff fingers can work more easily. A few people speak quietly about sending someone ahead to search for the trail. Others listen. No decision has formed yet. The fire gives them time. It gives them a place to think. You stand close enough to feel heat on your shins while your back remains cold. The contrast is almost comical. Half of you belongs to civilization. The other half belongs to the blizzard. This, apparently, is breakfast on the Oregon Trail. And still, something about it is comforting. The small circle of warmth, the steam beginning to rise, the shared silence between tired people, the way flame turns fear into activity. You look toward the blank prairie beyond camp. The road is hidden. The day is uncertain, but the fire is alive. For now, that's where everyone begins. Morning does not arrive gently on the prairie. It arrives as a change in pressure, a shift in light, and a sudden awareness that the cold has reorganized itself overnight. You step away from the fire and feel it immediately. The warmth that had gathered around your hands begins to fade within seconds. It is replaced by a clean, sharp air that feels almost like it has edges. Each breath becomes visible for a moment before disappearing into the grey sky. Around the camp, movement begins in careful stages. Wagons are checked first. Canvas coverings are tightened where snow has loosened them. Wooden frames are inspected with hands that feel stiff at the joints. Wheel ruts are studied beneath fresh accumulation, as if the ground itself might offer advice if looked at long enough. One well-documented reality of trail life is that mornings after heavy snow were often less about departure and more about assessment. Travellers had to determine not only where they were going, but whether they could move at all. You notice this in the way people move. No urgency yet, only evaluation. The oxen are brought forward slowly. Their breath rises in steady clouds, larger now in the colder air. Snow clings to their backs and melts in uneven patches where body heat pushes outward. They do not seem bothered, only attentive in the way large animals often are when humans begin rearranging their world. A man walks the line of wagons, stopping at each one. He presses a boot into the snow, judging depth. He squints toward the horizon, then he moves on without speaking much. The prairie does not offer clear answers this morning. Everything looks the same: white ground, white sky, a faint suggestion of direction that might just be imagination. An unusual detail recorded in several emigrant journals describes how people sometimes relied on subtle environmental cues when the trail disappeared. Wind direction across grass stubble, the angle of drift formation, even the behavior of birds or the pattern of exposed earth near creek beds. Today, those signs feel buried under uncertainty. You help gather small items from around the wagon, a tin cup still warm from last night's fire, a folded blanket that has frozen slightly at the edges, a rope stiffened by moisture. Each object requires attention before it can be used again. Nothing on the trail is ever simply picked up and put away. Everything demands a moment of negotiation. Nearby, someone discovers that a wheel has frozen slightly into place. A quiet effort begins to free it. Water is not poured over it, because that would only make things worse later. Instead, hands work carefully, loosening snow, rocking the wagon gently, easing pressure rather than forcing movement. The wagon responds slowly, as if waking up reluctantly. A soft groan of wood follows. Then the wheel shifts, a small victory, but a meaningful one. You glance toward the open prairie again, still white, still uncertain. The road that was hidden yesterday remains hidden today, but now there is a difference. People are no longer waiting for it to reappear. They are preparing to interpret it instead. This is how travel continues here, not through certainty, but through reading. A subtle shift in snowpack might suggest firmer ground. A slight rise in land might hint at drainage beneath. A cluster of darker vegetation might mark a creek line even if water itself is invisible. The landscape becomes a text that must be carefully interpreted rather than simply crossed. A quieter, lesser-told aspect of overland migration is how much intellectual effort it required. Decision-making was constant and often collective. Every adult contributed observations. Every mistake could become expensive. Every correct guess could save hours or days. You tighten your coat and listen to the camp. Voices remain low. No one is rushing, yet there is movement everywhere. A kettle is set back over a renewed flame. A child is wrapped more securely before being lifted onto a wagon bench. A strap is adjusted. A tool is checked. A map, if one exists, is unfolded again and again, as if repetition might improve its clarity. The wind shifts slightly, not stronger, not weaker, just different. People notice immediately. Heads turn, eyes narrow. One man points toward a distant line where snow appears slightly smoother, as if something beneath it might be guiding shape. Another disagrees quietly. A short conversation follows, careful and measured. No one wants to be confidently wrong. You find yourself watching the horizon more than the people. It is easy to assume the prairie is empty, but today it feels full of invisible structure, buried paths, hidden dips, forgotten crossings, the kind of geography that only reveals itself through movement. A faint memory of last night returns. The fire, the warmth, the sound of oxen breathing in the dark. Those moments feel far away now, even though only a short time has passed. That is another subtle truth of trail life. Conditions change so quickly that memory struggles to keep up. A decision is made, not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift in direction among the wagons. One lead team begins to move first, then another follows. The camp does not break apart so much as it unthreads itself from stillness. Snow crunches under hooves. Wheels begin to turn with slow resistance. Canvas flaps, tighten. People climb into wagons or walk alongside them, adjusting to motion again after stillness. You step back and watch the first wagon carve into the white. It leaves a faint impression. Not a road, not yet, just a suggestion that movement is possible. The prairie accepts it without reaction. Above, the sky remains pale and unreadable, but somewhere in its quiet depth the day has fully begun, and so the journey continues. Not because the path is clear, but because the travellers have decided to trust their ability to keep reading what the land is willing to reveal. The wagon does not like waking up. It complains in small and familiar ways. A wooden joint tight from cold, a wheel that resists movement for a moment too long, a canvas seam that pulls slightly before settling back into place. Nothing dramatic, but together it creates the sense that the entire structure is reconsidering its life choices. You climb in carefully as the company begins to move. The floor beneath you shifts with the first forward pull. supplies adjust their weight. A crate nudges against your leg, a tin cup slides a few inches before stopping against a folded blanket. Everything inside the wagon is in negotiation with motion. Outside, the prairie is still mostly white, but now it is no longer static. It begins to move past you in slow, uncertain waves. Snow drifts break under wheels, wind pushes across open ground. The sky hangs low and pale, like something unfinished. A widely observed reality of overland migration is that travel days after storms were often slower than expected. Even when snow stopped falling, the ground beneath remained uneven, soft, or hidden. Progress was measured not in speed, but in whether wagons remained upright and animals remained steady. You feel this immediately. Each turn of the wheel is careful, each step of the oxen deliberate. A man walks ahead of the lead wagon. Testing the ground with a pole, he stops frequently, looking down, adjusting direction slightly. The wagon follows his choices like a patient thought unfolding in real time. The trail is still invisible, but movement has resumed. That is enough for now. Inside the wagon, the atmosphere changes again. It is no longer the tight stillness of sleep. It is the contained motion of travel. Bodies adjust. Hands steady supplies. Someone holds a loose strap to keep it from swinging too much. Another person shifts weight to balance the wagon's uneven roll. You notice how quickly humans adapt to movement once it becomes necessary. Stillness feels like rest. Motion feels like purpose, even when neither is comfortable. A quiet detail from emigrant accounts describes how wagon travel often created its own rhythm inside the body. After days or weeks, people became attuned to the rocking motion, sometimes feeling uneasy when standing still for too long in towns or settlements. The body learns the road even when the mind resists it. The wagon creaks again. This time the sound feels less like protest and more like acceptance. You glance outside. The snow is thinner here, though still present. Beneath it, faint lines appear and disappear as the wagon passes. Not clear ruts, but suggestions of where other wheels have travelled before. Sometimes they vanish entirely, sometimes they reappear unexpectedly, like memories surfacing and fading in the same breath. A lesser-known aspect of trail navigation is how heavily emigrants relied on overlapping traces from earlier groups. Even when snow obscured the main route, subtle changes in ground colour or vegetation could indicate prior passage, but winter conditions often erased even these hints, forcing groups to rely more on interpretation than certainty. Ahead, the lead man slows. The wagons behind compress slightly as spacing adjusts. Something has changed in the land, not danger exactly, not safety either, just uncertainty. He kneels briefly, examining the ground, then stands and points slightly to the left. A new direction is chosen, no long discussion follows. There is no time for extended debate in weather like this. The wagons adjust, the oxen turn, movement continues. You feel the shift through the floorboards as the wagon follows the new path. It is subtle, but unmistakable. The entire group has altered course based on one person's reading of snow and slope. That responsibility feels enormous when you think about it too closely. You try not to think about it too closely. Instead, you watch the landscape pass. A stand of low brush appears, half buried in white, then disappears behind the wagon. A shallow dip opens ahead, then is crossed without incident. Snow clings in uneven patches to everything, making the world look both uniform and strangely textured at the same time. Inside the wagon, someone speaks quietly about repairing a strap. Another checks a bundle of food. Someone else simply watches the movement outside, as if trying to memorize the shape of uncertainty. The road remains hidden, but the company is no longer searching for a road in the strict sense. They are following a direction that feels most likely. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A faint wind returns, brushing across the wagons. Snow lifts in thin sheets from the surface and drifts sideways. Visibility reduces slightly. The lead man raises an arm. The wagons slow, again, Attention gathers forward. The Prairie offers no clear answer. Only suggestion. After a long pause, the arm lowers. The group continues. You realize how much of this journey is built on these quiet negotiations. Pause, observe, choose, move, repeat. No single decision guarantees success, only continuation does. The wagon rocks more gently now as the ground improves slightly. The oxen seem steadier. Their breath is visible but calmer. The cold remains, but the sharp edge of last night's storm has softened into something more manageable. You find yourself breathing more easily without noticing when it happened. The landscape begins to change in small ways. Not greener, not warmer, just less erased. Subtle ridges appear beneath the snow. The faint outline of drainage lines becomes visible if you look carefully enough. The world is slowly returning to shape. A small, almost forgotten detail from emigrant journals mentions how deeply relief could be felt when terrain regained definition after a blizzard. Not because conditions became easy, but because interpretation became possible again. Meaning returned to the land, even if only faintly. The wagon continues forward. Wood creaks. Leather straps tighten and loosen. Feet shift inside the wagon as bodies adjust to balance. Ahead, the lead wagon maintains its slow guidance, cutting through the white with careful persistence. You look once more at the horizon. It is still uncertain, but it is no longer completely blank. And for the first time since the storm began, that small difference feels like progress. By mid-morning, the Prairie begins to reveal its patience. Not all at once, and not in any comforting way, but in small corrections. A faint ridge appears beneath thinning snow. A line of darker grass shows where wind has failed to bury everything evenly. The world does not return to clarity so much as it remembers how to be readable again. The wagon follows that gradual return of shape. Inside, movement has settled into a steady rhythm. Wood creaks at predictable intervals now. The wheels no longer struggle with every rotation, though they still protest in low, tired tones. The oxen keep a constant pace, their breath rising like quiet signals of endurance. You sit near a bundle of supplies and watch the land slide past. A widely documented aspect of overland travel is how quickly wagon companies shifted from camp survival thinking into travel logistics once motion began again. Water sources, grazing opportunities, and terrain conditions became the primary focus, often replacing concerns that had dominated the night before. Yesterday was about warmth, today is about direction. Someone calls out from the lead wagon, and the word carries back through the line. A creek not visible yet, but expected ahead. The mention changes everything slightly, even without seeing water. The idea of it reorganizes attention. Animals will need it. People will need it. Wagons may need to rest near it. The Prairie seems to respond by becoming subtly more uneven. A detail often noted in emigrant accounts is that water sources along the trail were rarely convenient. They were not neatly placed or evenly spaced. They required detours, patience, and sometimes negotiation with terrain that resisted easy access. You feel that truth approaching before you see it. The wagons begin to angle downward. The ground slopes gently, snow thins further, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. Then, at last, a darker line appears ahead. Not wide, not dramatic, just a suggestion of water moving under ice. The creek, frozen at the edges, partially hidden but unmistakably present. The lead wagon slows. The company gathers again in loose formation. No one speaks loudly. Everyone watches. Water crossings are always moments of attention. Even when frozen, ice thickness must be judged. Banks must be assessed. Animals must be guided carefully. A wrong step can cause delay or injury, and delay in winter carries its own risks. You climb down as the wagon pauses. The ground beneath your boots is firmer here, but uneven. Ice hides under thin layers of snow. creating a deceptive surface that looks stable until weight tests it. You move carefully toward the edge of the creek. It's narrower than you expected, partially frozen, with dark water moving beneath a crust of ice broken in irregular shapes. Small openings reveal motion underneath, a slow, persistent flow that refuses to stop even in cold. A lesser-known reality of prairie crossings is how often travellers depended on such waterways for orientation. Even when trails vanished, creeks and rivers remained essential reference points. They guided direction, provided resources, and often determined where camps were formed. Someone tests the ice with a long pole. It does not crack immediately. That is a good sign, though not a guarantee. The lead man studies the surface, walking slowly along the edge. Others join him, spacing themselves out. Oxen wait behind, shifting weight and exhaling visible clouds. A decision is made after several minutes of observation. The wagons will cross, not here exactly, but at a slightly wider, shallower section, a short distance downstream. The company begins to move again in careful coordination. You walk beside your wagon as it rolls forward. The creek bends gently through the landscape, cutting a dark line through white. Snow-covered banks rise and fall unevenly. Bare branches of small shrubs protrude like thin markers of where water once shaped the land more freely. A quiet anecdote from frontier accounts describes how travellers often remembered specific water crossings more vividly than long stretches of prairie, not because they were always dangerous, but because they demanded attention, coordination, and shared effort. This crossing feels like that kind of moment. The wagons line up, one by one. They approach the chosen point. The first team steps forward. Hooves test the edge. Ice holds. For a few seconds, everything is still. Then movement continues. The wagon enters the crossing slowly. Wood groans. Ice shifts slightly beneath weight but does not break. Water remains hidden under the surface. Moving silently beneath the burden above it, you watch closely as the wheels pass over. Each rotation feels like a question answered correctly. The wagon climbs the far bank. Snow compresses under the wheels, then it is across. A quiet breath moves through the group, not spoken, but shared. The next wagon follows, then another. The rhythm repeats, crossing by crossing. You notice how quickly tension turns into routine once success is repeated. The first wagon is watched closely, the second slightly less. By the third, attention begins to relax. Though no one fully stops observing, when your own wagon approaches, you climb back in. The descent into the creek bed is gentle but noticeable. The wagon tilts slightly. Objects inside shift. A cup taps softly against wood. Someone steadies a bundle with a hand. Outside, the frozen water passes beneath you. You can hear it faintly, a low, distant movement under ice. Life continuing beneath stillness. Then the wagon climbs again. The far bank is firmer. The wheels gain traction. You emerge on the other side, and just like that, the crossing is complete. No celebration follows, only continuation. The company reforms its line and begins moving forward again, leaving the creek behind as a thin, dark memory in the snow. You glance back once, the waterline fades quickly. Snow begins to reclaim the crossing almost immediately, softening edges, blurring marks, turning certainty back into suggestion. Ahead, the prairie opens again, not fully revealed, but no longer completely erased. And as the wagons continue west, the day carries a quieter confidence than the morning suggested, as if the land and the travellers have reached a temporary agreement to keep moving together without too much resistance. The creek fades behind you faster than it should, not because it is small, but because the prairie has a way of swallowing to plenty the moment you stop looking directly at it. Within minutes of the crossing, the dark line of water softens into the background. Within a little longer, it becomes just another irregular shape in a landscape already full of irregular shapes. The wagons move on, the rhythm returns, wheel, step, creak, breath. Snow still clings to the ground, but it is thinned now, broken into uneven patches where wind has worked harder than snowfall. The land is beginning to speak again in subtle differences, slight rises, gentle dips, the faint memory of direction. You walk beside the wagon for a while, letting your legs adjust after the crossing. The air feels sharper here, cleaner somehow, less trapped. Ahead, the lead wagon slows again, not abruptly. Just enough to make the line of wagons respond in sequence. Something has changed. Everyone notices before anyone speaks. The lead man has stopped near a shallow rise in the land. He is looking outward, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something the rest of you cannot yet hear. You follow his gaze. At first, there is nothing, just white. Then, slowly, a shape emerges in the distance. A darker patch where snow does not lie evenly, low vegetation exposed by wind, perhaps a bend in the terrain, perhaps the edge of a drainage line. It is not a landmark anyone can name with certainty, but it feels like one. A widely observed reality of overland travel is that emigrants often relied on a combination of visible terrain cues and accumulated memory rather than fixed maps. The landscape itself became the guidebook, rewritten constantly by weather and season. You see that happening now in real time. The man ahead raises an arm, the wagon slow. The company gathers again into a loose cluster. People step down, stretch, look, point, then fall silent to observe more carefully. The Prairie offers no labels, only suggestions. The lead man walks a short arc across the snow, scanning the ground. He pauses at one point, then another. Each pause feels like a question asked of the earth. You notice how everyone watches his feet more than his face. Footsteps matter more than expression here. After several long moments, he points slightly upward along the rise, not decisive, not uncertain either, somewhere in between. The wagons begin to move again, slowly, carefully, as if the land itself might change its mind if disturbed too abruptly. You climb back into the wagon as it rolls forward. Inside, everything shifts again into motion balance. A crate nudges against a bundle. A blanket slides slightly. Someone adjusts their position to counter the slope. Outside, the snow is lighter now, almost fragile in places. Beneath it, the prairie is beginning to show its structure again, grass frozen into pale waves, subtle ridge lines that guide water, wind, and now wagons. The group crests the small rise. On the other side, the land opens differently, not dramatically, just enough to feel like a new chapter in terrain. Farther ahead, faint silhouettes of trees appear, thin and scattered, not a forest. Just enough to suggest shelter. Water nearby, or at least a change in geography. The sight alters the energy of the entire company. Not excitement exactly, more like relief that interpretation remains possible. A quieter detail often noted in emigrant accounts is how strongly people reacted to the first signs of trees after long stretches of open prairie. Even a small cluster could signal resources, navigation points, and psychological comfort. Trees meant edges, edges meant understanding. The wagons continue toward them. The ground becomes less uniform. Small stones appear beneath snow, then patches of exposed earth where wind has cleared the surface. You feel the wagon respond to each change in texture. Wood creaks differently on firmer ground. The oxen adjust their footing with more confidence. Conversation begins again in low tones. Talk of distance, talk of water, talk of whether this might be a place to pause or only pass through. No final decision is made yet. But the presence of trees changes the tone of discussion. You notice that your own thoughts feel slightly less heavy, not because anything is solved, but because the landscape has become readable again. Ahead, the trees draw closer. They are not large, not majestic in the way later stories might exaggerate. They are simply there, enduring, rooted, indifferent to the struggle of wagons passing through snow. Still, their presence feels significant. The company slows again near them, not stopping fully, just adjusting. A place is being considered, a possible camp, a possible pause. The leadman dismounts and walks among the trees, checking ground, snow depth, and shelter from wind. Others wait. You step down once more. The air here feels different, less exposed. The trees break the wind slightly, softening its edge. Snow collects differently under their branches, forming uneven mounds and sheltered pockets. You look up. Branches are bare, but they hold a quiet kind of structure against the pale sky. Someone nearby comments that wood might be gathered here if needed. Another notes that animals could be sheltered more easily than in open prairie. No one calls it home, but everyone recognizes that it's closer to something resembling rest. The historical record shows that emigrant groups often made decisions about stopping points based on a mix of necessity and opportunity, shelter from wind, access to water, and availability of grazing land frequently outweighed any strict sense of schedule. You watch as the wagons begin to cluster more deliberately among the trees, not chaotic, not hurried, but purposeful. A place is being formed, not permanent, not settled, but enough to pause the endless forward motion. The prairie still stretches beyond, unchanged in its vastness. But here, among thin trees and softened wind, the journey allows itself a moment to breathe, and for the first time since the storm began, movement slows not because of resistance, but because a better option has quietly appeared. The trees change the sound of the world. It is the first thing you notice, not what you see, but what you hear. The wind no longer moves freely across endless open ground. Instead, it breaks and bends through branches, turning into softer currents that pass in uneven waves. Snow no longer travels in straight lines. It drifts, circles, settles, and gathers in quiet pockets beneath the trees. The wagons come to a gradual stop, not as a single decision, but as a collective easing of motion. One after another, wheels slow, oxen lower their heads, people step down into snow that feels slightly less exposed than before. A small camp begins to form, not planned in detail, not formally arranged, just a natural clustering around shelter. You stand near the edge of the group and look deeper into the trees. The ground here is uneven, shaped by roots and wind and time. Snow fills hollows and softens contours, but the land beneath still has definition. It feels less like an open question and more like a place that can be understood with patience. A widely noted reality of wagon travel is that camps were rarely chosen for comfort alone. They were chosen for survival conditions that balanced wind protection, water access, and animal grazing. Trees like these offered at least two of those needs immediately, and sometimes a third if luck was generous. You watch as people begin to work without being told. That is another familiar pattern. Wagons are a position to form a loose boundary against wind. Animals are led into more sheltered areas. Bundles are unloaded with careful efficiency. Firewood becomes the first priority, even in winter. Even after storms, even in exhaustion, the need for fire remains constant. Someone moves deeper into the trees with an axe. The sound begins almost immediately. Wood meeting wood, sharp, measured, repetitive. Each strike feels like it carves a little more certainty into the day. You follow the sound and stop where visibility thins under branches. The snow here is deeper in places, untouched by wind. It cushions your steps. Above, branches hold scattered layers of white that occasionally fall in soft bursts when disturbed. A quieter detail often found in emigrant journals is how quickly people learn to read micro-environments like this. A sheltered grove could become a temporary workshop, a kitchen, or a resting area within minutes. Every small natural feature gained purpose. Here, the trees are not scenery. They are resources. They are protection. They are possibility. You return to the wagon as it is partially unloaded. Inside, too, things feel different now that motion has paused. Objects settle fully instead of shifting with movement. The crate that pressed against your leg earlier now sits still, heavy and familiar. Blankets regain their shape. Even the air feels less tense. Someone begins organizing supplies for cooking. Another checks animal harnesses. A child is lifted carefully down into the snow and immediately wrapped tighter, as though the cold might still be negotiating entry. A faint sense of relief moves through the group. Though it is quiet and unspoken, no one declares safety. No one assumes permanence. But there is a pause in urgency. That is enough. The fire is started again, this time more sheltered among the trees. The wind cannot reach it as directly here. Flames catch faster. Smoke rises in a more vertical line before drifting gently away through branches. Heat spreads more evenly this time. You hold your hands near the fire and feel warmth return with less resistance. Someone places a kettle near the edge of the flames. Another brings out supplies. The routine of camp resumes, but in a different tone than before. Less defensive, more structured. As if the environment has briefly agreed to cooperate. You look around. The wagons stand in a loose arrangement among the trees, their shapes partially softened by snow and shadow. Oxen are gathered nearby, calmer now that movement has stopped. Their breath forms steady clouds that dissolve into the colder air. A recurring theme in frontier accounts is how deeply temporary shelters influenced morale. Even brief protection from wind or open exposure could transform exhaustion into function. A grove of trees might not change the journey, but it could change the people making it. You feel that shift now. Fatigue is still present, cold is still present, uncertainty still exists beyond the trees, but it feels more distant, more manageable. A few travellers begin speaking in low voices about the next stretch of travel. One suggests staying longer if the weather worsens again. Another points out that supplies should be checked carefully before moving further. No decisions are final yet, but conversation is no longer limited to survival in the moment. It expands slightly into planning. That alone marks progress. You step away from the fire for a moment and walk a short distance between the trees. Snow muffles everything. Footsteps are soft. The world feels enclosed in a different way than the wagon provided. Inside the wagon, enclosure was tight and human-made. Here, enclosure is natural. Branches overhead, snow underfoot. Wind reduced to distant movement rather than constant force. You pause near a trunk and place a hand against the bark. Cold, rough, real. There is something grounding about it. Not symbolic, not dramatic, just physical. Cool certainty. A small observation recorded in many emigrant accounts is how often people describe trees as comforting after long stretches of open prairie, even when those trees offered no real resources beyond psychological relief and minor shelter. Humans seem to respond strongly to boundaries after exposure to endless space. You understand that instinct now without needing explanation. Behind you, the camp continues to organize itself. Fire crackles, metal clinks softly. Voices rise and fall in conversation that is calmer than earlier in the day. Somewhere deeper in the grove, someone continues cutting wood. The sound is steady, reliable, repetitive, a rhythm that suggests the day will continue to move forward regardless of uncertainty. You look back toward the wagons. For the first time since the storm began, the group does not feel like it is being pushed by weather. It feels like it is choosing its moment, not control, not mastery, just a brief, fragile sense of agency inside a landscape that rarely offers it. The trees stand quietly around the camp. The fire burns steadily within them, and the prairie waits beyond, still vast, still uncertain, but temporarily held at a distance by this small gathering of wood, warmth, and human persistence. Night does not fall here all at once. It arrives in style, slipping through branches first, then settling into the spaces between wagons, then finally resting on the camp itself like a second layer of snow that no one can brush away. The grove holds the wind better than the open prairie ever did. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that the fire can breathe without being constantly pulled apart by gusts. You sit near its edge and watch the sparks start to rise, then vanish into the darker space above the trees. The warmth feels deeper tonight, not because the fire is stronger, but because the world around it is quieter. A commonly noted observation in emigrant diaries is that camps placed near trees often became more conversational in the evenings. People stayed closer to one another, voices carried less, and the psychological distance between individuals seemed to shrink along with the physical exposure. You notice that now. People sit nearer the fire, wagons form a loose circle beyond. Animals are calmer, clustered in sheltered patches where branches reduce the wind. The day's urgency has dissolved into something slower. A man stirs the fire with a stick, sending a brief burst of sparks upward. Someone else passes around a cup of coffee. It is not better than earlier, but it feels more earned, which changes perception in ways that are hard to measure, but easy to feel. You wrap your coat tighter and lean slightly toward the heat. Conversation begins in low tones. Not about survival, not about immediate direction, about memory, about home, about things that feel distant but not lost. A quiet detail often found in frontier accounts is that evenings were when storytelling became most common. After labour, after uncertainty, after movement, people turned naturally toward narrative. It was a way to stabilise experience, to make sense of what had happened, and to soften what might come next. You listen without speaking at first. Someone mentions a river back east. Another recalls a house that no longer feels real in size or texture when compared to wagon life. Someone laughs softly at the idea that people once complained about short walks to wells or markets. It feels almost humorous now, in a distant way. Not because those concerns were trivial, but because they belong to a different scale of living. The fire pops. A small log collapses inward, sending a gentle wave of heat outward. For a moment, everyone is quiet again. Then a new story begins, not dramatic, not carefully structured, just a memory spoken aloud, a road crossed, a town passed through, a storm encountered long before this one. As the voices move, you notice how the grove seems to hold them. Trees do not amplify sound the way open land does. Instead, they contain it. They create a kind of acoustic intimacy where even small stories feel close. You find yourself thinking about how many nights like this have already passed on the trail. How many more will come? A subtle uncertainty runs beneath everything, even now. The question of continuation, of weather, of distance still remaining. But it is quieter tonight, less sharp. A lesser known reality of overland travel is that emotional intensity often fluctuated in cycles that mirrored weather patterns. Storms produced anxiety and urgency, clearer conditions brought planning and reflection, and sheltered moments like this produced memory and storytelling. The land shaped emotion as much as experience. You take another sip of coffee. It is slightly less bitter now. Or perhaps you are simply more accustomed to it. Nearby, a child leans against an adult and listens to the voices without fully understanding the content. They respond more to tone than meaning. Calm voices mean safety. Laughter means stability. Silence means rest. The child begins to drift towards sleep. You notice how exhaustion returns when it is allowed space. Earlier, it was held back by cold and motion and uncertainty. Now it arrives gently, as if it had been waiting for permission. Around the fire, someone begins to hum softly. Not a song with a clear sichum or a structure, just fragments of sound shaped by memory, the kind of tune that does not belong to performance, but to presence. You look past the fire toward the edge of the grove, beyond the trees, Darkness stretches into the prairie again. It is still there, still vast, still unknowable in its full extent, but it feels farther away now, as if the trees have created a temporary boundary between this small circle of warmth and everything beyond it. A quiet observation from historical accounts is that emigrants often described such places as holding points, not destinations, but pauses in motion where life could briefly reassemble itself before continuing forward. This grove feels like that. Not an end, not a home, just a pause where breath can slow and thought can settle. The fire dims slightly as wood shifts. Someone adds another branch, and flame returns quickly as if relieved to continue its work. You notice your own body beginning to relax in stages. Shoulders first, then hands, then the steady awareness of cold becomes less dominant. The night is not warm, but it is no longer hostile. Voices soften, one by one. Conversations fade into silence, not abruptly, just naturally, as if words have finished their necessary task. The hum stops, the stories end, the fire remains. You lean back slightly and look up through branches. Above them, the sky is darker now, with faint traces of stars returning in small scattered points. They are not bright, but they are present, and presence is enough. Somewhere in the grove, an ox exhales, a wagon settles, a branch creaks softly in the cold. The camp continues existing in its quiet arrangement of warmth and shelter, and as sleep begins to approach again, you remain within that fragile balance between movement and stillness. Held briefly between the endless prairie and the temporary comfort of trees that decided, for one night at least, to offer protection. Morning arrives with a different kind of silence, not the deep, enclosed quiet of night among trees, and not the sharp emptiness of open prairie during a storm, but something in between, a softer stillness, one that feels temporary, as if the land itself is resting before deciding what kind of day it will become. You wake slowly near the fire, or what remains of it. The embers glow low beneath a thin layer of ash, holding on to warmth the way tired travellers hold on to memory. Someone is already kneeling nearby, coaxing it back to life with careful hands. Dry twigs are added one by one. Breath is used sparingly to encourage flame without overwhelming it. It responds reluctantly at first, then slowly. It returns. A small flame rises again, bending slightly before stabilizing. Around the grove, movement resumes in quiet coordination. Wagons are checked, animals are fed, supplies are reorganized. The rhythm of travel reasserts itself, not urgently, but inevitably. You step away from the fire and look between the trees. The snow here is uneven, marked by footprints from yesterday and fresh disturbances from this morning. Beneath the surface, the ground is no longer uniform prairie. It slopes gently in places, dips in others, revealing the subtle geography that had been invisible during the storm. A lesser-known aspect of wagon travel is how often camps were chosen not only for the shelter, but also for what the land revealed after stopping. Travellers learned quickly that terrain spoke more clearly when given time, and overnight, pauses often uncovered details that the movement had concealed. You notice a faint track near the edge of the grove, not a road, not clearly defined, just a suggestion of repeated passage, flattened grass under snow, a subtle compression of earth that differs slightly from untouched ground. It might be from earlier wagons, it might be from the animals, it might simply be coincidence on the trail. Certainty rarely arrives in a single form. You walk closer to it, then stop. The line fades in and out depending on angle and light. When the sun shifts slightly behind cloud cover, it almost disappears. When light strengthens, it returns. The land does not commit easily to being read. Behind you, someone calls out that breakfast is nearly ready. The sound pulls attention back towards camp. Life here always competes between observation and necessity. You return slowly, near the fire. People are already gathered again. A pot hangs over steady flame. Coffee steams in uneven bursts. Bread or cornmeal mixture is being divided carefully, each portion measured without ceremony but with a clear awareness of limits. An established reality of emigrant life is that food distribution often required quiet discipline. Supplies had to last uncertain distances, and every meal carried the awareness that the next resupply point might be days or weeks away. You accept a portion and sit on a fallen log near the fire. Heat reaches your face first, then your hands. The contrast with the cold air is immediate and grounding. Someone nearby speaks about the path ahead. Another replies that the trees likely thin after a few miles. Someone else suggests that if weather holds, travel could improve significantly by afternoon. No one sounds certain, but uncertainty is no longer paralyzing. It is simply part of conversation. A child runs a short distance between wagons before being called back. The movement is brief, joyful, and quickly contained by cold air and adult caution. The fire crackles, wood shifts, ash rises and settles again. You eat slowly. The food is simple, but warmth changes its character. What would be plain in another context becomes sustaining here. Not because the ingredients are different, but because the conditions are. A curious detail often mentioned in frontier accounts is how sensory memory becomes unusually strong during long journeys. Smells, tastes, and sounds often become permanently linked with specific environments. Smoke, cold air, metal cups, and wet wool tend to stay together in memory long after the journey ends. You notice that already beginning. The fire, the trees, the snow beyond them. All of it forming a single impression rather than separate experiences. After breakfast, work resumes more deliberately. Wagons are inspected for damage from the storm. Harnesses are repaired. Snow is cleared from storage coverings. Animals are checked again, more carefully now that time allows it. You help where needed. Moving between tasks without a fixed assignment, everyone does the same. Labour here is not specialised so much as shared. Shifting based on necessity, at one wagon, a wheel is examined closely for cracks. At another, a strap is replaced. At another, supplies are reorganised to balance weight more evenly after the uneven conditions of the previous days. The grove continues to provide shelter as work unfolds. Wind still passes through, but softened by branches. Snow still falls lightly in places, but no longer dominates the environment. You pause for a moment and look outward through the trees. Beyond them, the prairie stretches again, not white in the same overwhelming way as before, but open and waiting. The path forward is not clearly visible, yet it feels less erased than it did during the storm. Movement will resume, that much is certain. When it does, the wagons will leave this small protected space and return to the larger uncertainty of open land. But for now, there is preparation, there is adjustment, there is a brief pause where life can be organised rather than endured. The fire continues to burn steadily behind you, and within the grove, the morning unfolds with quiet purpose, as if the land itself has allowed a short moment of clarity before the journey begins again. The grove does not feel like a place that belongs to anyone. It feels borrowed, temporary, like the land has briefly agreed to host the idea of safety before returning to its usual indifference. You notice this as the camp continues its slow morning rhythm. Nothing here is permanent. Even the fire, so steady now, is only a temporary negotiation between wood, flame, and human attention. It will last as long as someone tends it. After that, it will return to ash and memory around you. Labour continues in familiar patterns. Wagons are packed again with practiced efficiency. Animals are guided into position with quiet commands. Supplies are redistributed, so weight is balanced more carefully after the storm. No one speaks about the road ahead as something guaranteed. It is treated instead as something negotiated hour by hour. A commonly observed reality of overland migration is that survival depended heavily on small, often invisible routines, not grand moments of endurance, but repeated acts of organization, repair, and adjustment that kept entire groups moving forward. You watch these routines unfold in real time. Near one wagon, a woman tightens a strap with slow precision, testing it twice before moving on. Near another, a man checks axle grease with hands already darkened from earlier work. A child carries a small bundle of cloth between wagons, carefully stepping through uneven snow as if performing an important mission. Each task is simple on its own. Together they form continuity. You find yourself helping with one of the wagons, steadying a crate while someone repositions it inside. The wood is cold against your gloves. The movement requires coordination more than strength. A small adjustment, a slight shift, then it fits better. No celebration follows, only a nod. Work here rarely asks for acknowledgement. It simply asks to be completed. Nearby, someone begins discussing water again. Not the creek from earlier, but the next likely source. The conversation is practical, measured, and cautious. The distances are estimated in terms of effort rather than certainty. A lesser-known aspect of trail life is how often travellers thought in terms of physical endurance rather than precise measurement. Hours of walking, condition of animals, and condition of weather often mattered more than miles on a map. You notice that mindset shaping every decision. Nothing is abstract, everything is physical. Time becomes footsteps, distance becomes strain, weather becomes resistance. As the camp prepares to move, a quieter rhythm emerges among the women of the group near the fire. Cooking is resumed in a more structured way than before, not the hurried effort of storm survival, but a steady preparation for travel. Water is heated, simple food is divided, containers are secured for movement. There is no pause in responsibility, only a shift in form. A faint warmth spreads through the grove as sunlight filters more directly between branches. The snow above begins to loosen slightly, dropping small clusters that fall softly to the ground. You look up briefly. The branches hold both light and cold at once, as if the environment is undecided about which season it fully belongs to. A quiet detail often found in emigrant accounts is how deeply people noticed small environmental transitions after storms. Not dramatic changes, but subtle ones. A slight warming of air, a change in snow texture, a shift in animal behaviour. These small signals often mattered more than maps or schedules. Someone calls out that the lead wagon is ready. The tone is not urgent, it is procedural. The camp begins to break its temporary structure. Wagons that formed a loose circle are turned outward again. Animals are aligned, ropes are checked. Canvas coverings are secured. The fire is reduced carefully, not extinguished, but left in a state that can be rebuilt later if needed. You stand near the edge of the grove and look outward. The prairie waits just beyond the trees, open, wide, uncertain, yet no longer blank in the same way it was during the storm. There are traces now, hints of direction, subtle variations in terrain that suggest movement is possible again. The lead wagon begins to roll first, then another follows. The group reforms into a line that stretches beyond the shelter of trees. You climb into your wagon as it begins to move. The wheels creak softly at first, then settle into a steady rhythm. Behind you, the grove slowly recedes. Branches thin out. Wind strengthens again. The open prairie returns in full. Snow remains, but it no longer dominates the world in the same overwhelming way. It is now part of a larger landscape that includes ridges, dips, and distant suggestions of continuation. Inside the wagon, objects shift gently with motion. The crate that once pressed against your side now slides slightly into a more stable position. Blankets settle. The small interior reorganizes itself around movement once again. Outside, the lead wagon sets the direction. There is no grand announcement. Only forward motion. The prairie accepts this without resistance. It has seen travellers come and go many times before. You look ahead. The road is still not clearly visible, but the feeling of being completely lost has eased. In its place is something quieter, a sense that progress, however uncertain, is still possible. And so the wagons move forward again, leaving behind the grove that held them through the storm, returning once more to the wide, open conversation between wheels, wind, and endless land. The prairie opens slowly, like something remembering its shape. At first, it is only subtle changes. The snow lies thinner in some places, thicker in others. The wind moves without the protection of trees, but it no longer carries the same harsh urgency as during the storm. It feels more like motion than attack. The wagons stretch into a long, uneven line again. You sit inside yours, watching the world return to its familiar scale of distance and silence. The grove is now far behind, reduced to a dark suggestion against the horizon. Ahead, everything is wide again, not blank in the same way as before, but open enough that the eye must work to interpret it. A widely observed reality of overland travel is that once shelter was left behind, the psychological effect of openness often returned quickly. Travellers described feeling both freer and more exposed within the same hour. You feel a version of that now. Inside the wagon, movement is steady. Outside, the oxen pull with patient consistency. Their breath rises and disappears into cold air. The wheels carve faint impressions that are already being softened by drifting snow. A child sits bundled near the centre of the wagon, watching the shifting landscape with quiet attention. There is no complaint, only observation. Children on the trail often adapted to motion more quickly than adults, accepting change without needing explanation. You notice how the group has reorganized itself since leaving the grove. Talk is minimal but present. Someone comments on the direction of wind. Another notes that the ground appears firmer here than before. A third suggests they may reach better grazing land by late afternoon if conditions hold. No one contradicts them. No one confirms either. The prairie offers no immediate answers, only gradual feedback. A quieter detail often recorded in emigrant accounts is how deeply travellers depended on shared interpretation of small environmental signals. A slight shift in animal behaviour, a change in snow density, or a subtle variation in slope could influence decisions that shaped entire days of movement. Ahead, the lead wagon slows slightly, not stopping, just adjusting. The line compresses. Everyone watches. A shallow dip appears in the terrain, filled with wind-packed snow that looks firmer than it actually is. The lead wagon tests it carefully. The oxen step forward. Snow compresses but holds. The wagon continues. The rest follow in sequence. You feel each adjustment through the floorboards. The wagon reacts to the land like a conversation being spoken through wood and wheel. Inside, objects remain mostly stable now. The earlier chaos of storm and creek crossing has given way to predictable motion. Even discomfort becomes familiar enough to ignore. You look outward again. The prairie begins to show faint structure. Low ridges stretch across the distance. Barely visible under snow, these are not landmarks in the dramatic sense, but they provide orientation. The land is no longer a single uniform surface. It has texture again. A lesser-known aspect of trail movement is how much relief came not from rest, but from readability. When terrain could be interpreted, even imperfectly, anxiety often decreased. You understand that now. Even uncertainty feels different when it has shape. The wagons continue at a steady pace. Time passes without sharp distinction. Morning blends into midday slowly. The light shifts slightly, becoming less grey and more diffuse. At some point, someone in the wagon passes you a small piece of dried food. It is simple, unremarkable, but grounding. You eat it without ceremony. The act feels routine, which is its own kind of comfort. Outside, The wind picks up briefly, then settles again. Snow drifts sideways for a moment before returning to a slow descent. The landscape remains open, but no longer hostile in the same concentrated way as before. There is movement, but it is no longer resistance. A quiet detail from emigrant journals suggests that many travellers began to measure progress not by miles, but by stability of motion. A good day was not defined by distance covered alone, but by lack of interruption. Today feels closer to that kind of day. The wagon rolls smoothly over a gentle rise, then descends slightly, then levels again. The rhythm becomes almost meditative. You find yourself less focused on destination and more aware of continuity. The oxen ahead maintain their steady pull. Their endurance defines the pace of the entire company. Without urgency, but without pause, occasionally, someone calls out a small observation from the lead wagon, a suggestion of direction, a warning about uneven ground, a note about snow depth. Each message is brief, each is absorbed quickly, no extended discussion follows. The system relies on trust in shared perception. As afternoon approaches, the light changes again, it becomes softer, less direct. Longer shadows stretch across the snow even though the sun is not fully visible. The prairie begins to feel wider again, not because it has changed, but because your awareness of its scale has returned. Yet something is different now. The memory of trees still lingers. The shelter they provided remains present in thought, even as they disappear behind distance. It is a quiet anchor in recollection. The wagons continue forward, the horizon remains open. But for the first time since the storm, movement feels less like survival against conditions and more like participation within them. Not easy, not certain, but stable enough to continue. And in that stability, the journey resumes its steady, unbroken rhythm across the vast and patient land. Afternoon light on the prairie has a different personality. It is less harsh than morning, less uncertain than the hours after a storm, and less deceptive than evening shadows that stretch too far across open ground. It simply exists, spreading evenly over snow and land without asking for attention. The wagons continue in a steady line, no longer struggling through deep snow or navigating hidden creeks. The movement has become more consistent. The wheels no longer fight the terrain with every rotation. Instead, they roll with a rhythm that feels almost predictable. Inside the wagon, the atmosphere has shifted again. Not warmer exactly, but calmer. Objects remain in place without constant adjustment. Blankets stay where they are placed. Supplies no longer shift with every uneven patch of ground. Even sound feels more organized. As if the wagon itself has settled into understanding the road again. You sit quietly and watch the prairie move past. The snow is still present, but thinner now. In places it is broken entirely, revealing pale grass beneath that bends under cold wind. The land is no longer a single uninterrupted surface. It has begun to show contrast again. A widely observed reality of overland migration is that recovery after severe weather often felt gradual rather than immediate. Even after storms passed, conditions continued to influence movement for hours or days afterward. Travel rarely returned to normal in a single moment. You feel that gradual return now. The wagons pass over a stretch of firmer ground, then another, then a slight dip where snow collects more heavily. Each variation is noted without comment. The company no longer needs to speak constantly to understand direction. Movement itself has become a shared language again. Ahead, the lead wagon maintains its course. Occasionally it slows, then continues, as if confirming the land's agreement with its path. You notice how attention in the group has relaxed slightly, not absent, but less strained. People are no longer scanning every inch of ground for hidden danger. Instead, they observe in broader strokes: sky, slope, wind, distance. A quieter detail often found in emigrant accounts is that moments of relative ease were not experienced as full relief, but as temporary balance, Travellers understood that conditions could change again without warning, so calm was never treated as permanent. Still, calm is felt and it matters. A child leans against the side of the wagon, looking out at the passing landscape. There is less tension in their posture now. Earlier fear has faded into simple curiosity again. The prairie, once overwhelming, has become scenery rather than threat. You notice small animal tracks crossing the snow ahead of the wagons, light impressions, faint and scattered. They move in different directions, suggesting life moving independently through the same space. The presence of these tracks subtly alters perception. The land feels less empty when marked by movement beyond human travel. Someone in another wagon calls out a suggestion to adjust spacing between teams. The wagons respond gradually, widening slightly to avoid uneven ground. The adjustment is subtle but important. On long journeys like this, spacing between wagons often changed depending on terrain, visibility and animal condition. Too close and accidents could spread quickly. Too far and coordination became difficult. Balance mattered more than perfection. The prairie offers no fixed arrangement, only conditions that must be interpreted repeatedly. As the afternoon progresses, the light grows softer again. Shadows lengthen across the snow and stretching farther than they did earlier. The sun itself is not clearly visible, but its presence is felt through shifting tones in the sky. The air feels slightly less sharp than in the morning. Not warm, just less aggressive. Inside the wagon, someone begins quietly repairing a strap that loosened during earlier movement. Another reorganizes supplies that shifted during travel. These small tasks fill the rhythm between observation and motion. You find your thoughts drifting between present movement and memory of earlier days on the trail. The storm, the creek crossing, the grove of trees, each feels distant now. Even though they occurred within the same stretch of time, that compression of experience is something emigrants often recorded without fully explaining it. Days on the trail could feel both long and strangely layered, as if multiple journeys were occurring within one. The wagon climbs a gentle rise, then levels again. From this higher point, the prairie stretches farther than before, not empty in the same erased way as during the blizzard, but open in a way that suggests continuity rather than absence. Movement feels easier here. The oxen maintain steady pace without visible strain. Their breath still rises in pale clouds, but their steps are more confident. You notice how sound has changed too. Less crunch of deep snow, more consistent rolling of wheels, occasional wind moving across open ground. The prairie has returned to a rhythm that can be read through senses alone. A lesser-known aspect of trail travel is how deeply people relied on these sensory patterns to judge progress. Changes in sound, light, and resistance often mattered more than formal measurement. You're experiencing that directly now without needing to think about it. The wagons continue forward. No dramatic shift occurs. No announcement is made. But gradually, the company settles into a shared understanding that the worst of the storm has passed. Not permanently, not with certainty, but enough to continue without constant strain. And so the prairie, vast and unchanging in appearance, becomes once again a space of movement rather than resistance, carrying the wagons forward under a sky that slowly deepens toward evening. Evening arrives quietly on the prairie, as if it has learned not to announce itself too loudly after everything the land has already endured. The light shifts first, not dramatically, just a slow softening of colour across snow and sky. The whites begin to turn faint gold, then pale grey, then something cooler and deeper as the sun lowers beyond the edge of the world. The wagons continue forward, but the pace has changed again. Not from difficulty, not from resistance, from instinct. People begin to recognize the end of the day in the air before any formal decision is spoken. Movements become more deliberate. Conversations shorten, attention turns toward where the company might safely settle for the night. A widely observed reality of overland migration is that stopping points were often chosen as much by fading light as by geography. When visibility declined, travel naturally slowed and decisions about camp became urgent but controlled. Ahead, the lead wagon signals a gradual reduction in speed. The line responds like a single body easing into rest. Snow is thinner here, but still present in uneven patches. The ground beneath shows more texture again, gentle slopes, small ridges, areas where wind has shaped the surface into subtle patterns that only reveal themselves at this hour. You sit inside the wagon and feel the change in motion. The steady roll becomes softer, less continuous, more hesitant. The oxen lower their heads slightly as if understanding that the day is closing. A quiet conversation begins between wagons. Short signals, simple agreements, nothing formal, but enough to coordinate what comes next. A place for camp is being considered, not because the journey is over, but because night is approaching, and the prairie does not forgive those who ignore that fact. You look outward as the wagon slows further. The land ahead is open, but not empty. There are subtle rises in the terrain that offer slight protection from wind, who gathers differently in these low areas, suggesting shelter without complete enclosure. Someone in the lead wagon raises an arm. The company stops. No one speaks loudly. There is no need. The decision is forming through shared observation rather than command. This is one of the more subtle structures of wagon travel. Leadership existed, but it often functioned through consensus shaped by experience, visibility, and immediate conditions rather than formal authority. The wagons begin to arrange themselves, not in a circle like the grove, not in a strict line, but in a loose protective shape that considers wind direction and terrain slope. Animals are guided inward, supplies are prepared for unloading, people step down carefully into snow that is now firm but uneven. The air feels colder again as motion stops. Warmth from travel fades quickly when stillness returns. You stand beside the wagon and look at the forming camp. It is not dramatic. It does not resemble the storm survival from earlier days. It is quieter, more practiced, almost routine in its structure. Wagons settle into position. Ropes are secured, bundles are lifted down. The familiar rhythm of evening camp begins again, shaped by a repetition and necessity. A fire is prepared, this time without trees, but with experience guiding the effort. Dry materials gathered quickly and kindling is arranged with care. Someone kneels and shields the initial spark from wind that has returned with the open terrain. Flame appears, small at first, then steady, then strong enough to anchor the space. Light spreads outward, touching faces, wagons, and snow in shifting patterns. You approach the fire and feel warmth return to your hands, not immediate, but noticeable, around you. Voices begin again, but softly, less about uncertainty now, more about continuation. The day's movement is discussed briefly. Distance covered, terrain crossed, conditions ahead. Nothing certain is claimed. Only observations are shared. A lesser-known detail of trail life is how evening fires often served as informal planning spaces. People reviewed what had been seen during the day, adjusted expectations for tomorrow, and quietly reassessed risks based on shared impressions rather than formal maps. You listen as the fire crackles. Somewhere nearby, an ox exhales deeply. A wagon creaks as it settles into place. Snow drifts slowly through the edge of firelight, glowing briefly before disappearing into darkness. The prairie beyond the camp is wide again, but no longer feels erased or hostile in the same concentrated way as before. It feels open but readable in fragments. The sky deepens. Stars begin to appear in scattered points above the horizon. Not yet bright, just present. That presence alone feels significant after the long day. You sit down near the fire and feel the accumulated weight of the journey settle into stillness. Not exhaustion alone, but continuity, the sense of having moved through storm, through uncertainty, through water and snow, and still arriving at evening intact. Around you, the camp stabilizes, wagons in position, animals secured, fire established, people resting or preparing quietly for night. There is no declaration of completion, only the simple fact of having reached another end of day. The wind moves gently across the open prairie beyond the camp, but here within the gathered wagons and firelight, it feels distant, almost respectful. You look into the flames as they rise and fall in steady rhythm, and as the night gathers slowly around the edges of the world again. The journey pauses not because it is finished, but because it has found, once more, a place to rest before continuing forward into whatever the prairie still holds beyond the dark, sweet dreams.